War does not begin with movement. It begins with certainty. By now, certainty had already formed. Temujin and Jamaka were no longer drifting toward conflict. They had already crossed the point where coexistence was possible. The steppe had chosen its shape. Two systems, two visions of order, two leaders who no longer represented themselves, but everything behind them. And once that happens, war is not a decision. It is the next step. Temujin stood at the center of a structure he had built slowly. Not through inheritance, not through tradition, but through accumulation. Loyalty earned, roles assigned, order created from instability. It was not perfect. It was not complete. But it was functional. And function is enough to begin war. Across the steppe, Jamaka stood at the head of something very different. A system that did not need to be built, because it already existed. Aristocracy, lineage, hierarchy that had governed the steppe long before Temujin began to change it. His power was not constructed. It was inherited. And that inheritance carried weight. Because people trust what has existed longer than they can remember. At first, the conflict did not explode. It assembled. Quietly. Clans aligned. Alliances hardened. Movements became deliberate. And every small decision reinforced the same outcome. Separation. Temujin's followers did not prepare for war in the traditional sense. They reorganized. Groups were restructured. Roles clarified. Expectations reinforced. Because Temujin did not rely on raw strength. He relied on coordination. And coordination does not begin when war starts. It begins long before. Jamaka's coalition prepared differently. They gathered numbers, influence, traditional authority. Their strength lay in presence, in the visible weight of established power. And on the steppe, numbers matter, especially when systems collide for the first time. The first movements between the two forces were not grand battles. They were tests, probing actions, small engagements that measured response, measured cohesion, measured weakness. Temujin's system responded with consistency, not overwhelming force, but organized reaction. Jamaka's system responded with scale, large movements, strong presence, immediate pressure. Two different approaches, two different philosophies of war. One built on structure, one built on weight. And at first, weight dominated. When the first major confrontation came, it did not resemble the wars Temujin would later become known for. It was not precise. It was not controlled. It was raw. Clans clashing. Forces meeting without the refined coordination Temujin would later master. And in that environment, Jamaka held the advantage. His numbers were greater, his coalition broader, his authority more widely recognized. Temujin's system, still forming, was not yet strong enough to fully counter that scale. The result was not immediate destruction. But it was clear. Temujin was pushed back. Not broken, but forced to retreat. And retreat on the steppe is not just movement. It is exposure. Because retreat reveals weakness. It shows limits. It tells the world that the system is not yet complete. Jamaka did not simply defeat opposing forces. He made an example. Captured enemies were not treated with restraint. They were executed in ways designed to send a message. Boiled alive. Destroyed publicly. Not for necessity, but for demonstration. Because demonstration shapes perception, and perception shapes alignment. Temujin witnessed this, not as an observer, but as a participant, as someone who had built a system now tested and found incomplete. And this moment, this first defeat, is critical because it defines everything that follows. Temujin did not collapse. He did not disappear. He did not abandon the structure he had built. He adapted, because adaptation is what his system was designed to do. Retreat gave him something more valuable than temporary victory. It gave him clarity. He saw where coordination failed, where loyalty fractured under pressure, where communication broke down. And once seen, those weaknesses could be removed. Jamaka, meanwhile, interpreted victory differently. As confirmation that traditional hierarchy still held power, that established order could still dominate emerging systems. And in the short term, he was correct. But short-term correctness does not guarantee long-term dominance, because environments continue to change, and systems that rely on existing strength must eventually confront evolving conditions. Temujin returned from defeat not as a broken leader, but as a refined one. His system did not shrink. It tightened. Loyalty became more defined. Structure became more rigid internally, but more flexible in execution. He began to remove the last elements of tribal fragmentation within his ranks. Not completely, but deliberately, because fragmentation is what caused failure under pressure. And failure, when understood, becomes instruction. This is the moment where Temujin stops being simply adaptive and becomes intentional. War is no longer something he is reacting to. It is something he is preparing to control. The steppe, meanwhile, does not pause. Jamaka's victory shifts perception across tribes. Some move toward him. Others hesitate. Some watch, because victory attracts alignment. But so does consistency. And Temujin's system, even in defeat, had shown something unusual. It did not collapse. It withdrew, reorganized, and remained intact. And that matters, because systems that survive defeat are more dangerous than those that avoid it. Temujin now understands something that cannot be learned without loss. That strength alone is not enough. That numbers alone do not guarantee victory. That coordination must hold under pressure, or it is meaningless. And from this point forward, his war will change. Not immediately, not visibly, but structurally. The first war with Jamaka does not end in triumph. It ends in understanding. And understanding is far more dangerous, because it turns survival into strategy. And strategy is what wins the wars that follow. Defeat does not end a war. It clarifies it. For Temujin, this was the moment where illusion disappeared. The belief that survival alone could lead to dominance. The belief that loyalty, once earned, would hold under pressure. The belief that structure did not need to be complete before conflict began. All of it removed. What remained was something sharper, more controlled, more deliberate, because now he knew exactly where he had failed. Not in courage, not in intent, but in structure. His system had held together, but not tightly enough. It had moved, but not precisely enough. It had fought, but not as one. And on the step, anything that does not act as one will break when pressure increases. Temujin did not respond emotionally. He did not rush back into battle. He stopped, and stopping in this context is not hesitation. It is recalibration. His followers gathered again, not in celebration, not in confidence, but in silence shaped by defeat. And that silence mattered, because it allowed something new to form. Temujin began to rebuild, not from the outside, but from the inside. The first change was subtle, but absolute. Loyalty would no longer be assumed. It would be structured. Clans would not simply remain intact within his system. They would be broken apart, reorganized, redistributed. Men who had once fought beside their relatives were now placed into new units. With strangers, with individuals chosen for function rather than blood. This was not a small decision. It was a direct attack on the oldest system of the steppe. Tribal identity. Because tribal identity creates internal loyalty, but external fragmentation. And fragmentation is what had weakened him in the First War. So it had to be removed. Not gradually, not symbolically, but completely. Temujin began organizing his forces into new structures. Groups defined not by lineage, but by size and function. Units of 10, hundreds, thousands, each with clear leadership, each accountable, each replaceable. Because replaceability is what makes systems resilient. If a leader falls, the structure continues. If a group breaks, it can be rebuilt without collapsing the whole. This is the beginning of something different. Not a tribe, not an alliance, but a machine. Jamoku did not make these changes. He did not need to. His system already functioned within the logic of tradition. Hierarchy remained intact. Clans stayed unified under their leaders. Authority flowed through lineage. And in stable conditions, this system works. But the steppe was no longer stable. Temujin understood that now, fully, and once understood, he could no longer return to the old way. Training began to change, not in scale, but in precision. Movements became coordinated, signals standardized, expectations clarified. Each individual within the system understood not only their role, but how that role connected to others. This is what had been missing, and this is what would define everything that followed. Temujin also changed how reward functioned. Before, loyalty had been recognized. Now, it was measured. Those who performed were elevated. Those who failed were replaced, not punished unnecessarily, but removed from positions where failure could spread. Because failure in coordinated systems multiplies, and multiplication of weakness leads to collapse. Temujin would not allow collapse again. His system became stricter, not in cruelty, but in expectation. Because expectation defines behavior, and behavior defines outcome. At the same time, he did not isolate himself. He continued to observe the steppe, watching how clans moved, how alliances shifted after his defeat, who aligned with Jamaka, who hesitated, who remained undecided. Because information is as important as force, and information, when used correctly, reduces uncertainty before conflict begins. Jamaka, meanwhile, stood in a position of strength. His victory had reinforced his authority. Clans respected him, feared him, aligned with him. His coalition appeared dominant. And in the immediate moment, it was. But dominance built on a single victory does not always sustain itself, because it does not account for change in the opposing system. Jamaka expected continuation. Temujin was creating transformation. This difference is not visible immediately, but it determines outcome. Temujin's followers began to change as well, not just in structure, but in mindset. They were no longer simply loyal. They were conditioned to respond, to act within system logic, to trust not just the leader, but the structure itself. And trust in structure is stronger than trust in individuals. Because individuals can fall, structures persist. The rebuilding phase was not fast. It was not dramatic, but it was complete. Layer by layer. Weakness removed. Layer by layer. Cohesion increased. Layer by layer. A new kind of force began to form. One that would not rely on numbers alone, or tradition alone, or momentum alone, but on coordination under pressure. And coordination, once perfected, changes everything. Temujin did not rush back into war, because now he understood something essential. The next conflict would not be decided by who struck first, but by whose system held together longer when everything began to break. The steppe, watching from all sides, began to shift again. Slowly, subtly, because while Jamaka held power, Temujin was building something different. Something not yet fully visible, but increasingly difficult to ignore. Defeat had not ended his rise. It had defined it. And from this point forward, he would not fight as he had before. He would not lead as he had before. He would not build as he had before. Because now, he was no longer adapting to the steppe. He was preparing to reshape it. Rebuilding does not announce itself. It hides. It strengthens quietly. And when it is complete, the world only notices after it is too late. Temujin did not return to war immediately. He waited, not passively, but deliberately, because what he was building could not be tested too early. A system that fails under pressure once can be repaired. A system that fails twice does not recover. So he ensured it would not fail again. His forces were no longer a collection of allied clans. They were units, defined, structured, interchangeable. Men no longer fought beside family because they were family. They fought beside whoever the system placed them with, because the system came first. And this was the fundamental shift. Loyalty had moved from blood to structure, from tribe to command, from identity to function. Temujin's army was no longer an extension of the steppe. It was something new, something the steppe had never fully seen before. And that difference would decide everything. Across the plains, Jamaka remained powerful. His victory still echoed. His authority still stood. His coalition remained intact. But time had passed. and time changes perception. Victory fades, memory weakens, and what remains is not what was done, but what continues to work. Temujin began to move again, not with noise, not with sudden aggression, but with precision. Small actions first, controlled engagements, measured expansions of influence. Each movement designed not to overwhelm, but to test, to confirm that the new structure held. And it did. Groups moved in coordination. Commands were followed with consistency. Breakdowns that had once appeared in battle were no longer present. And with each successful action, confidence returned. Not the confidence of belief, but the confidence of proof. Jamaka began to notice, not immediately as threat, but as anomaly, because Temujin was no longer behaving as expected. He was not reacting emotionally, not rushing to reclaim lost ground, not attempting to match force with force. He was moving differently, and difference, when sustained, becomes pattern. Temujin's system expanded again, not rapidly, but steadily. Clans that had once hesitated began to reconsider, because they observed something important. He had lost and survived. He had rebuilt and improved. And improvement after defeat is more persuasive than victory alone, because it shows direction. Jamaka still held the advantage in scale. His coalition remained larger, more established, more traditional. But size is not everything, not when systems differ, because large systems can fragment, and smaller systems can hold. And when fragmentation meets cohesion, outcome changes. The second phase of conflict did not begin with a single decisive battle. It unfolded through a series of engagements, each one reinforcing the same pattern. Temujin's forces moved with coordination, Jamaka with weight. Temujin's adapted mid-action. Jamaka's followed established command. Temujin's system learned during conflict. Jamaka's relied on pre-existing structure. And slowly, that difference began to matter. Not in one moment, but across many. Jamaka's coalition began to show strain. Not collapse, but pressure, because coordination gaps appeared. Communication slowed. Decisions became less responsive. Not because the system was weak, but because it was not designed for rapid adaptation. Temujin saw this, and he exploited it, not through reckless attack, but through controlled pressure, forcing movement, creating situations where response time mattered more than size. And in those moments, his system held. Jamaka did not always. The balance began to shift, not dramatically, but directionally. And direction is what determines outcome over time. The final confrontation did not come as surprise. It came as inevitability. Both systems had reached full expression. Both had tested each other. Both had revealed their strengths and weaknesses. And now, there was nothing left but resolution. The battle itself was not defined by chaos. It was defined by structure. Temujin's forces moved as units, not as separate clans. Commands flowed. Adjustments were made in real time. Pressure was applied where weakness appeared. And once weakness appeared, it was expanded. Jamaka's forces resisted, fought, held ground, But coordination gaps widened. And gaps once opened do not remain contained. They spread. And spreading failure is what breaks systems. The outcome became clear before it fully ended. Jamaka's coalition began to collapse. Not instantly, but progressively. Sections failed. Connections broke. Control weakened. And once control weakens in large systems, collapse accelerates. Jamaka was captured, not in chaos, but at the end of a process that had already determined the result. The man who had once been Temujin's closest ally now stood as the final piece of an opposing system that could no longer exist. And here, something important happens. Temujin does not respond with spectacle. He does not repeat the brutality that Jamaka had shown earlier. He offers something different. A choice. A form of respect. Jamaka refuses, because his system does not allow survival without dignity. And dignity in that structure is tied to identity. He cannot live within the system that replaced his own. So he chooses death. And Temujin grants it. Without humiliation. Without public cruelty. Because this moment is not about revenge. It is about completion. The opposing system has ended. Not just its leader, but its structure, its logic, its ability to compete. And with that, the step changes. Not immediately, not visibly, but fundamentally. Temujin is no longer one leader among many. He is now the central force, not because he declared it, but because no system remains that can challenge his. The rise is complete. The step is unified. And for the first time, Temujin stands not as survivor, not as challenger, but as something else entirely. Something larger than tribe, larger than alliance, larger than the world he was born into. And what comes next will no longer be about surviving the step. It will be about unleashing it. Power is not real until it is recognized, not by one man, not by one tribe, but by the entire system around it. After the fall of Jamaka, there was no longer an opposing structure strong enough to challenge Temujin on the step. Not in fragments, not in alliance, not in principle. For the first time, the step did not divide around him. It settled under him. But dominance alone is not enough. Dominance can still fracture. It can still dissolve. It can still return to chaos if it is not formalized. And Temujin understood this. Victory in war had unified the step, but only structure could keep it unified. So he did something no leader before him had fully achieved. He transformed victory into system. The gathering was called, not as a celebration, but as recognition. A Kurultai, a council of leaders, of those who now existed within the same structure, not as rivals, but as components. And this moment mattered, because power that is not acknowledged remains unstable. But power that is recognized becomes reality. The tribes gathered. Leaders who once opposed each other now stood within the same space. Not equal, but aligned, because alignment had already been decided by outcome. What remained was formal acceptance. Temujin stood before them, not as a tribal chief, not as a war leader, but as something new, something the step had never fully defined before. a singular authority over all Mongol tribes. And in that moment, he was given a name, Genghis Khan, not just a title, a transformation. Genghis Khan, a ruler not of one tribe, but of all. And names matter, because names define perception, and perception defines how systems behave. From this moment forward, Temujin no longer exists in the same way. He is now Genghis Khan, a symbol of unified authority, a central point around which the entire steppe reorganizes itself. But naming alone is not enough, because symbols must be supported by structure. So Genghis Khan began to formalize what he had already been building. The system that had won him the steppe now became the system that would govern it. The tribal structure was broken, not weakened, not adjusted. Broken. Clans were no longer the primary units of organization. The system replaced them. Groups of 10, hundreds, thousands, each defined by function, each commanded by individuals chosen for ability. Not birth, not lineage, ability. This was revolutionary, because it removed the foundation of tribal fragmentation and replaced it with unified structure. Loyalty no longer flowed horizontally through blood. It flowed vertically through command. And vertical systems scale. Horizontal ones fracture. This is how the steppe was stabilized. Not through peace, but through organization. Genghis Khan also formalized law, not in the way settled empires would later define it, but as a system of expectations, rules that applied across tribes, across units, across the entire structure, often referred to as the yasa. Though not written in a single form, it defined behavior, punished betrayal, rewarded loyalty, and most importantly, created consistency, because consistency is what transforms authority into control. Without it, power is temporary. With it, power becomes system. Communication was standardized. Signals, messengers, command structures, everything designed to ensure that information moved as efficiently as possible across distance. Because distance had always been the weakness of steppe systems. Now, it became manageable. The army was no longer separate from the state. It was the state. Every man within the structure had a role. Every role connected to others. Every connection reinforced the whole. This is not just an army. It is a machine. And machines do not behave like tribes. They do not rely on emotion. They do not depend on personal loyalty alone. They function. And that is what made Genghis Khan's system different. It could continue even when individuals failed. It could expand without losing cohesion. It could absorb pressure without collapsing. This is the moment where everything changes. Because the steppe is no longer just unified. It is organized. And organized power behaves differently than united power. United power can still dissolve. Organized power persists. Genghis Khan understood something now that few others in his world did. That conquest is not just about defeating enemies. It is about maintaining control after victory. And maintaining control requires structure. Not just force, not just fear, but system. The Kurultai did not end with celebration. It ended with transformation. The steppe had become something new. no longer a field of competing tribes, no longer a cycle of alliance and betrayal. It had become a unified system under a single authority. And that authority was now ready to move beyond it. Because once internal conflict is resolved, external expansion becomes inevitable. The system had no more internal resistance, no more structural opposition. And systems without internal opposition do not remain still. They expand. Genghis Khan now stood at the center of something the world had never seen before. A fully unified, fully organized steppe power. And the steppe, once a place of survival, was about to become something else entirely. A force. And forces do not stay contained. A unified steppe does not remain a steppe for long. It becomes direction. Once internal resistance is gone, systems do not pause to admire their own stability. They move. Genghis Khan had done what no one before him had fully achieved on that scale. He had turned fragmentation into structure, and structure into obedience. But now, structure demanded expansion, because a system built for coordination cannot remain idle. It begins to seek pressure, to test itself, to define its limits, and then to break them. The first targets were not chosen for conquest alone. They were chosen for clarity, to confirm that the system worked beyond its origin, to test whether coordination that functioned in the steppe could function against fortified societies beyond it, to see whether organization could defeat walls, cities, empires, and older civilizations that had never fully adapted to steppe warfare. To the south and east stood the Jin dynasty, a vast structured empire that believed in walls, administration, and permanence. A world built on agriculture, fortification, and slow-moving authority. In contrast, Genghis Khan's system moved like weather. Vast, distributed, unpredictable, and now directed. This was not just cultural difference. It was structural incompatibility. And structural incompatibility always resolves through pressure. The first campaign against the Jin did not begin with total invasion. It began with movement, scouting, raids, testing responses, measuring reaction speed. Because war for Genghis Khan was no longer instinct. It was data collection. His armies moved across borders not as tribes seeking plunder, but as units probing systems. How fast do they respond? Where are their weaknesses? What breaks first under pressure? Cities along the frontier began to fall into this new reality, not as isolated events, but as patterns. Walls that once symbolized permanence began to reveal their limitation. They were strong against siege, but not against coordination, not against mobility, not against systems that refused to behave like traditional armies. And the Mongols did not behave traditionally. They surrounded. They withdrew. They returned. They cut supply. They never stayed in one predictable form long enough to be countered effectively. And in this instability, Jin defenses began to strain, not collapse immediately, but erode, because systems are not defeated in single moments. They are weakened across repeated interactions. Each raid exposed a new vulnerability. Each withdrawal revealed response patterns. Each return exploited what had just been learned. This is where warfare transforms. From violence to adaptation, Genghis Khan did not rely on brute force alone. He relied on feedback loops. Every encounter improved the next. Every battle refined the system. Every mistake was absorbed, not repeated. And this is what made the Mongol system fundamentally different. It was not static power. It was learning power. The Jin dynasty responded as empires do, with fortification, with bureaucracy, with layered defense systems designed for stability. But stability assumes predictability, and predictability was no longer present. As campaigns continued, Mongol forces began to integrate new technologies and expertise. Engineers, siege specialists, artisans from conquered or surrendered populations. Because Genghis Khan did not reject external knowledge. He absorbed it and repurposed it into his system. This was not cultural assimilation. It was structural expansion. The system became more complex without becoming less cohesive. And that is rare. Most systems collapse under added complexity. This one adapted. Cities began to fall. Not all at once, but progressively, each one revealing the same pattern. Initial resistance, then pressure, then breakdown of coordination, then collapse. And once that pattern is understood, future victories become predictable, not guaranteed, but structured. The psychological effect across the region was as important as the military one. Because once a system demonstrates consistent superiority under certain conditions, those conditions begin to define perception. Fear spreads not through single defeats, but through expectation of defeat. An expectation changes behavior before contact ever occurs. Within Genghis Khan's own system, something else was happening. Coordination was improving further. Not just in battle, but in administration, in logistics, in communication across expanding distances. Because expansion introduces complexity, and complexity requires refinement. The system was no longer just military. It was becoming imperial in function, without yet calling itself an empire. Genghis Khan did not declare permanence. He enforced structure, and structure, once stable, becomes self-reinforcing. The Jin campaign was not yet complete, but the pattern was established. Step coordination against imperial rigidity. Mobility against fortification. Adaptation against tradition. And in this stage, adaptation begins to win more often than not. Not because it is stronger in every sense, but because it is responsive. And response speed determines survival in dynamic conflict. As the campaign continued, Genghis Khan did not slow his system. He refined it. Each success increased confidence. Each failure improved structure. Each new region added complexity that was absorbed rather than resisted. The world beyond the steppe was now no longer distant. It was being entered systematically, and what had once been a unified steppe power was now becoming something larger, something expanding outward not as conquest alone, but as organized inevitability. The question was no longer whether Genghis Khan could leave the steppe. It was how far the system could go before encountering something it could not absorb. And at this point, there was no answer yet. Only motion. Forward. Expansion changes everything. Not because it introduces new enemies, but because it changes what a system must become in order to survive itself. Genghis Khan's campaigns against the Jin dynasty were no longer isolated raids or border pressure. They had become sustained structural contact between two worlds. One built on mobility and adaptation. One built on fortification and permanence. And permanence, once challenged repeatedly, begins to reveal its limits. Each city that fell did not fall in the same way, but it followed a similar logic. First contact, then testing, then disruption of supply and coordination, then psychological pressure, and finally, collapse. Not always immediate, but inevitable once internal cohesion broke. Because walls do not fail first. Systems inside them do. Within the Mongol structure, something equally important was developing. Scale was increasing, and scale always introduces strain. More territory meant longer communication lines. More commanders meant more delegation. More delegation meant greater risk of fragmentation. But Genghis Khan's system was not built on static hierarchy. It was built on distributed function. Each unit operated within clear structural expectations. Each commander understood not just their role, but the logic of the system they served. And that understanding allowed autonomy without collapse. This is what made expansion sustainable. Not control from the center alone, but internalized system logic at every level. Genghis Khan did not need to micromanage every action. He needed consistency, and consistency was enforced through structure, discipline, and outcome-based evaluation. As campaigns continued, Mongol forces began to integrate deeper elements of siege warfare. This was not natural to steppe tradition, but it was necessary, because systems that cannot adapt to new forms of resistance eventually stagnate. Engineers were captured or recruited. Siege technologies were adopted. Techniques refined through exposure to fortified cities were incorporated into Mongol operations. This was not cultural transformation. It was functional absorption. The system did not remain the same, but it did not lose coherence. And coherence under change is what defines durability. Across Jin territories, responses began to shift. Initial confidence in fortified defense weakened as repeated breaches demonstrated that walls alone were not sufficient. The psychological structure of defense began to erode. Because defense depends not just on strength, but on belief in permanence. And that belief was now under pressure. Each successful Mongol operation reinforced a growing perception that resistance would eventually fail. And perception is not passive. It actively influences decisions within defending systems. Cities began to reconsider resistance timelines. Alliances began to shift internally. Some regions delayed confrontation. Others attempted negotiation. Because systems under pressure begin to prioritize survival over principle. Genghis Khan did not interpret this as victory yet. He interpreted it as system response. And system response must be tested further before conclusion. Within his own ranks, expansion created new challenges. Distance increased. Command chains stretched. Local commanders gained more responsibility. And responsibility without clarity leads to divergence. So structure was reinforced again, not by increasing control, but by reinforcing expectation. Units were defined more clearly. Commands standardized further. Communication routes optimized. And failures were corrected through restructuring rather than punishment alone. because punishment removes individuals, but restructuring improves systems. The Mongol war machine was no longer just effective in the steppe. It was becoming effective in siege environments, urban environments, dense logistical systems. And that shift mattered more than any single victory, because it meant the system was no longer limited by its origin. It was extending beyond it. Meanwhile, the Jin dynasty faced a different kind of pressure. Not only military, but systemic. Their structures were designed for stability across large populations and fortified regions. But they were not designed for rapidly adaptive mobile warfare at scale. This mismatch created friction that accumulated over time. Each defeat reduced confidence. Each delay increased vulnerability. Each internal debate slowed response. And in dynamic conflict, slowness is weakness. Genghis Khan continued to expand pressure strategically. Not everywhere at once, but in sequences, targeting key regions, forcing responses, redirecting defensive capacity, exploiting delay. This was no longer simple warfare. It was system dismantling, not of people, but of coordination. Because once coordination breaks, numbers lose meaning. The Jin Empire did not collapse yet, but its structure was no longer intact in the same way. It was reacting rather than initiating, defending rather than shaping. And that transition is critical, because systems that lose initiative rarely recover it fully. Across the Mongol system, confidence grew. Not arrogance, but confirmation. The system worked beyond its origin. It worked under new conditions. It worked against fortified societies. And it adapted while doing so. That is what made it dangerous on a scale the world had not yet fully understood. Because this was no longer the rise of a tribal confederation. It was the emergence of an expanding adaptive system. And systems like that do not stop at borders. They continue until resistance becomes structurally equivalent, or until they encounter something they cannot integrate. At this stage, nothing like that had appeared yet. Only continuation, only expansion, only forward movement. And the steppe system, now extended into empire-scale conflict, continued doing what it had learned to do best. It advanced. Expansion does not feel like conquest at first. It feels like repetition. The same pattern, the same logic, the same system applied again and again until geography itself begins to change shape around it. By this stage, Genghis Khan's campaigns against the Jin dynasty had become less about individual battles and more about sustained systemic pressure. Not a single front, but many points of contact, each one testing the same reality. Could the Jin system respond fast enough to match a force that refused to behave in predictable form? So far, the answer kept shifting toward the same direction. No, the Jin Empire was not collapsing in a single moment. It was experiencing something slower, more dangerous, a gradual loss of control over coordination. And coordination is what holds empires together. Without it, size becomes vulnerability instead of strength. Within Mongol operations, movement was no longer random or opportunistic. It was structured. Units operated with increasing independence, yet within strict systemic logic. Orders did not need to be repeated constantly. They were understood. And understanding at scale is what allows expansion without fragmentation. Genghis Khan was no longer simply directing campaigns. He was maintaining a system that could operate beyond immediate presence. That is the real transformation occurring now. Not just war leadership, but distributed control. Across Jin territory, cities continued to respond in predictable cycles. Resistance, siege pressure, disruption of supply routes, internal strain, negotiation attempts in some regions, and eventual breakdown where coordination failed first. What Mongol forces learned was not just how to win battles, but how systems fail, and that knowledge became its own form of power. Because once you understand failure patterns, you can reproduce them deliberately. The Jin military attempted to adapt. Fortifications were reinforced, garrisons reorganized, more centralized command structures were introduced in some regions. But these changes came too slowly. And speed matters more than design in active conflict. Each adjustment arrived after Mongol tactics had already shifted. Each reinforcement was met with a new method of pressure. It was not static warfare. It was adaptive interaction. And adaptation always favors the faster system. Within the Mongol structure, something critical was becoming clearer with every campaign. Distance was no longer a weakness. It was being absorbed. Communication networks improved. Messenger systems became more reliable. Command transmission became more standardized. And local commanders gained authority within defined limits. This balance mattered because too much centralization breaks under scale. Too much autonomy breaks coherence. The system survived by balancing both. The Jin dynasty, meanwhile, struggled with internal complexity. Multiple layers of administration slowed reaction time. Local commanders did not always align with central strategy. Information traveled slowly or inconsistently. And inconsistency in war creates gaps. Gaps become vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities become entry points. As Mongol forces continued their pressure, they began to exploit not just physical terrain, but structural delay. They moved where response would be slow. They struck where coordination was weakest. They withdrew before counteraction could fully organize. This rhythm created a new kind of battlefield, not defined by front lines, but by timing. And in timing-based conflict, the more coordinated system tends to win. Inside Mongol ranks, success reinforced confidence in the system itself, not just in leadership, but in method. This is important, because when systems believe in their own structure, they become self-reinforcing. Mistakes are corrected internally. Successes are replicated. Learning is continuous. And continuity is what allows expansion across different environments. The Jin Empire began to shift from offensive posture to defensive survival in more regions. Not everywhere at once, but progressively. Some regions held, others weakened. Some attempted negotiation, others fortified, but none could fully reset the systemic imbalance that had developed. Because imbalance was no longer local. It was structural, and structural imbalance cannot be fixed through isolated action. It requires systemic reform, which is nearly impossible under sustained external pressure. Mongol campaigns also began integrating more sophisticated siege capabilities. Not from tradition, but from acquisition. Engineers, techniques, and knowledge systems were absorbed from conquered or surrendered populations. This transformed Mongol warfare further. It was no longer purely mobile steppe warfare. It was hybridized. Mobility plus siege capability. Speed plus endurance. Flexibility plus destruction capacity. And that combination was new at this scale. The Jin system could still resist. It still had strength, still had resources, still had cities capable of prolonged defense. But its responses were increasingly reactive rather than strategic. And reactive systems lose initiative over time. Across the broader region, perception was also changing. Smaller states and border regions began to interpret Mongol expansion not as isolated invasion, but as a sustained structural force, something that did not retreat permanently, something that adapted after each encounter, something that returned stronger each time. And perception like this alters political behavior even before direct contact. Alliances shift. Resistance hesitates. Options narrow. Not because force has fully arrived, but because expectation has changed. Genghis Khan's system continued to expand its operational reach, not through uncontrolled aggression, but through structured pressure applied across multiple fronts, each movement reinforcing the same underlying truth. That coordination, when sufficiently advanced, becomes its own form of dominance. And as long as that coordination holds, expansion continues, not as ambition, but as outcome. By now, war had stopped feeling like an event. It had become a condition, a constant pressure applied across entire regions, shaping decisions before they were even made. The Jin dynasty was still standing, but it was no longer intact in the way empires are meant to be intact. It was fragmented under pressure, not destroyed in one stroke, but strained across many. And strain is what breaks systems over time. Mongol forces under Genghis Khan did not operate as a single mass moving blindly across territory. They moved as distributed units, coordinated but independent, flexible but aligned. Each group understood the wider system they were part of, and each acted within that understanding without needing constant direction. This is what allowed expansion without collapse, because central control has limits, but systemic understanding scales. Genghis Khan had now transitioned fully into that role. Not just commander, but system maintainer. His authority was no longer exercised only through direct orders. It was embedded into the structure of the army itself. That structure was now doing the work of control. Across Jin territory, pressure continued in cycles. Not uniform destruction, but targeted disruption. One region would be struck. Another would be observed. Another would be bypassed entirely. This uneven pressure created uncertainty in response planning. Because the Jin system could not predict where the next major disruption would occur. And uncertainty forces overextension. Armies are stretched thin. Resources are divided. Communication lines become strained. And once strain becomes systemic, failure becomes a matter of time. Within fortified cities, defenses still held in many places. Walls remained strong. Garrisons remained disciplined. Local command structures still functioned. But function alone is not enough in adaptive warfare, because function must match environment. And the environment had already changed. Mongol forces were no longer behaving like traditional siege armies. They were behaving like a learning system. Each engagement refined their approach. Each resistance revealed new weaknesses. Each withdrawal preserved strength for future adjustment. And that cycle repeated across multiple fronts. Not chaotic, not random, but structured adaptation. Jin commanders began to notice a pattern, not just in losses, but in timing. Attacks often came after defensive adjustments, as if the Mongols were responding not only to physical resistance, but to systemic behavior itself. This created a deeper psychological pressure, because it meant the enemy was not just strong, it was observant. An observation changes how defenders behave. Within the Mongol structure, captured knowledge was not wasted. It was integrated. Engineers, artisans, siege specialists, and administrative knowledge were absorbed into the expanding system, not as cultural replacement, but as functional enhancement. The system became more complex without losing cohesion. And that is one of the rarest transformations in large-scale conflict, because most expanding systems become unstable as complexity increases. The Mongol system did not. It reorganized complexity into structure. Across the Jin Empire, internal pressure began to increase, not only from external attacks, but from internal strain caused by continuous defense requirements. Resources were depleted in some regions. Troop rotations became harder to maintain. Local leaders struggled with coordination between central commands and regional realities. And every delay in response widened gaps further. Meanwhile, Mongol strategy continued to evolve. They no longer relied solely on direct confrontation. They used movement to create imbalance. They targeted supply routes, communication paths, secondary cities that supported larger strongholds. Because collapsing support systems weakens main systems without direct assault. This is systemic warfare, not destruction of walls, but breakdown of what sustains walls. Jin leadership attempted reforms in some areas. More centralized control, stricter military coordination, attempts to standardize response procedures. But these reforms came under pressure, not calm conditions. And reforms under pressure are always incomplete, because they respond to damage rather than anticipate it. The Mongol system, however, operated from initiative. It dictated the rhythm of conflict, not always perfectly, but consistently enough to maintain pressure advantage. And in long-term campaigns, consistency becomes dominance. Across the wider region, perceptions shifted again. What had once been seen as rapid raids or unpredictable incursions was now recognized as structured expansion. A system capable of sustained adaptation. One that did not exhaust itself after victory, but improved. And systems that improve after contact are fundamentally more threatening than systems that merely conquer, because they evolve through resistance. At this stage, the Jin dynasty was no longer simply defending territory. It was defending coherence. And coherence is harder to maintain than territory, because it exists inside the system itself. And once coherence begins to fracture, recovery becomes increasingly unlikely without full structural transformation. Genghis Khan's campaigns continued moving forward, not as isolated battles, but as continuous pressure applied across multiple levels of a weakening structure. Each success reinforcing the same pattern, each resistance revealing the same limitation, and each cycle bringing the system closer to a point where resistance no longer functions as strategy, but only as delay. The step-born system had fully entered imperial-scale warfare, and it was proving that it could operate in that environment without losing itself. That realization spread slowly, but steadily, and once it spreads far enough, it changes everything that comes next. At a certain point in war, victory stops being surprising. It becomes expected, not because it is guaranteed, but because the pattern has already been established often enough that it begins to shape belief. Genghis Khan's campaigns against the Jin dynasty had reached that stage. Each engagement no longer felt like an isolated struggle. It felt like another expression of the same underlying system pressure. And that pressure was not weakening. It was compounding. Genghis Khan now commanded something that could no longer be described simply as an army. It was a multi-layered system of coordinated movement, intelligence gathering, siege capability, and adaptive response. And the key feature of this system was not strength alone, but feedback. Every action produced information. Every engagement refined future behavior. Every resistance improved the next attempt. This is what makes systems dangerous at scale. They do not just act. They learn. The Jin dynasty still held immense structural weight. Cities remained fortified. Administrative systems still functioned across large regions. Military forces still existed in organized formations. But coordination between these elements had begun to weaken. And when coordination weakens, strength stops acting as a single force. It becomes fragmented pressure. And fragmented pressure is easier to resist in parts, but harder to manage as a whole. Mongol forces continued applying pressure across multiple regions simultaneously. Not always in the same way. Sometimes direct assault. Sometimes feints. Sometimes deep raids into logistical networks. And sometimes complete withdrawal after testing responses. This variability created uncertainty in Jin planning, because no single defensive strategy could cover all possible approaches. And when defense cannot predict offense, it becomes reactive. Within the Mongol system, this unpredictability was not chaos. It was design. Each variation had purpose. Each movement tested a specific layer of resistance. Each retreat preserved strength while extracting information. And over time, this created a map, not of geography, but of weakness. Jin commanders began to experience a different kind of pressure. Not just military pressure, but informational pressure. They could not fully understand where the next major strike would occur. And uncertainty forces conservative decisions. Conservative decisions slow response. And slow response creates openings. Across multiple campaigns, these openings began to widen. Some cities held longer than others. Some regions resisted effectively for a time. But even successful resistance often came at a cost. Resources depleted. Troop fatigue increased. Local coordination strained under repeated cycles of defense. And in war, exhaustion accumulates silently. Meanwhile, Mongol integration of captured expertise continued. Engineers improved siege efficiency. Local knowledge improved navigation and supply strategies. Administrative systems were partially adopted or adapted where useful. This created a hybrid system, not purely nomadic, not purely imperial, but something in between. A mobile empire capable of learning from sedentary structures without becoming dependent on them. This is where Genghis Khan's system becomes fundamentally distinct from previous steppe powers. It does not reject complexity. It absorbs it. and reorganizes it into function. Within Jin territory, leadership began to experience internal tension. Different regions faced different levels of pressure. Some advocated stronger, centralized resistance. Others pushed for negotiation or withdrawal strategies. But under continuous external pressure, unity becomes harder to maintain because decisions are forced under stress rather than deliberation. And stress-driven decisions are often inconsistent. Mongol forces continued to exploit this inconsistency, not through overwhelming force alone, but through timing, attacking when coordination was weakest, withdrawing when resistance consolidated, returning when fragmentation reappeared. This rhythm became a form of control, not of territory, but of system behavior. And controlling behavior is more powerful than controlling land, because behavior determines outcomes. By this stage, perception across the region had fully shifted. Genghis Khan's system was no longer seen as a temporary invasion. It was understood as persistent expansion, a force that did not dissipate after contact, but adapted and returned. And this perception alone began to influence political decisions beyond immediate battlefields. Some regions began preemptive alignment. Others avoided confrontation altogether when possible, because expectation of defeat can be as decisive as defeat itself. Inside Mongol ranks, the system continued refining itself. Command efficiency improved. Logistics scaled more effectively. Coordination across distance became more reliable. And the structure held together even as it expanded. This is the key achievement of this phase. Expansion without fragmentation. Pressure without collapse. Complexity without breakdown. And as long as that remains true, the system continues forward. The Jin dynasty was still not fully destroyed, but it was no longer operating as a unified system. It was operating as pressured regions trying to maintain coherence under continuous strain. And that is a fundamentally different condition, because unified systems resist. Fragmented systems delay, and delay under sustained pressure becomes collapse over time. Genghis Khan did not need a final decisive moment yet, because the system itself was already trending toward resolution. Each campaign reinforced the same trajectory. Less resistance, more adaptation, greater Mongol control over timing and initiative. And in long campaigns, trajectory matters more than individual battles. The system was moving in one direction, and that direction was no longer reversible through isolated action. The step-borne structure had become something larger than its origin. It was now operating as an expanding adaptive force across imperial space. And the Jin dynasty was learning, slowly but unmistakably, that it was no longer fighting a war of equal systems. It was fighting a system that was evolving faster than it could respond. And that imbalance, once established, does not remain temporary. It continues until it resolves. One way or another. There comes a stage in every long war where the battlefield stops feeling like a place. It becomes a process, not where armies meet, but where systems continue to interact until one of them can no longer maintain structure. By now, the Jin dynasty was no longer facing a single front of invasion. It was facing persistent structural pressure across multiple regions at once. And pressure spread across systems does something important. It exposes what holds them together. Genghis Khan had not changed his system in any sudden way. He had refined it continuously. Each campaign added clarity. Each resistance added information. Each victory reinforced coordination. And coordination at this scale becomes self-sustaining. Mongol forces were no longer simply adapting to Jin defenses. They were learning from them faster than the Jin system could adjust in return. That imbalance became the defining feature of this phase of war. Jin cities still held strong walls, still maintained garrisons, still functioned under administrative order. But those elements no longer worked as a unified system under pressure. Some regions prioritized defense. Others attempted negotiation. Others reinforced local autonomy to survive immediate threats. And this fragmentation of response created uneven resistance. Uneven resistance creates predictable openings. And predictable openings are what adaptive systems exploit best. Mongol strategy became increasingly refined, not in complexity alone, but in precision. They no longer needed to strike everywhere. They needed to strike where the system would react most inefficiently, where communication would be slowest, where coordination would take longest to form. Because delay in war is weakness, and weakness compounds under repeated pressure. Sieges became more systematic, not just attempts to breach walls, but to dismantle the conditions that allowed cities to sustain resistance. Supply routes were targeted. Surrounding regions were destabilized. Reinforcement pathways were disrupted before they could be used. And over time, cities that once relied on endurance began to rely on uncertainty. How long can we hold? When will relief come? What happens if it does not? And once those questions become central, the defensive system is already shifting internally. Within Mongol ranks, the structure continued to evolve without breaking cohesion. Commanders operated with greater autonomy within defined system rules. This allowed faster response to changing conditions. But autonomy was not chaos. It was controlled flexibility. And controlled flexibility is what allows large systems to scale without losing integrity. Jin leadership attempted to respond with consolidation. Stronger central directives. More rigid command structures. Attempts to unify response across regions. But under constant pressure, centralization often becomes reactive rather than strategic. Because information arrives late, and decisions are made under incomplete understanding. Meanwhile, Mongol forces continued applying layered pressure. Not always direct confrontation. Sometimes psychological pressure. Sometimes logistical disruption. Sometimes full withdrawal to force overextension. And this variability kept Jin responses unstable. Because stability requires predictability. And predictability no longer existed. In some regions, resistance began to weaken not through defeat, but through exhaustion. Troops could not be rotated effectively. Resources became strained. Local commanders faced increasing difficulty maintaining morale under prolonged pressure. And morale is not just emotional. It is structural, because it determines whether systems continue to function under stress. Across the wider war zone, perception of Mongol capability continued to shift. What had once been seen as external raids was now understood as sustained systemic warfare, a method of conflict that did not rely on holding territory immediately, but on breaking the systems that held territory together. And once that understanding spreads, behavior changes before contact. Some regions avoided confrontation entirely when possible. Others delayed decisions. Others attempted negotiation or submission strategies to avoid full-scale disruption. Because the cost of resistance was becoming clearer over time. Within Mongol structure, expansion continued to reinforce itself, not only through conquest, but through absorption. Engineers, administrators, siege specialists, and local knowledge systems were integrated into operations where useful. This increased effectiveness without reducing mobility. And that combination remained rare in pre-modern warfare. By the end of this phase, the Jin dynasty was no longer functioning as a single coherent system across its entire territory. It was functioning as partially connected regions under varying levels of pressure. Some still strong, some weakening, some already structurally compromised. And this uneven state is often the most dangerous for an empire, because it creates instability inside the system itself, not just at the edges. Genghis Khan did not need to force immediate total collapse. The system was already moving toward that outcome through accumulated pressure and coordination loss. Each campaign reinforced the same direction. Less Jin initiative, more Mongol control of timing, more fragmentation of response, and increasingly, less ability to reset balance. At this stage, the war is no longer about who wins battles. It is about which system can maintain coherence longer under sustained transformation pressure. And so far, one system is learning faster than the other can adapt. And in that imbalance, the future begins to take shape. Slowly, but unmistakably, there are moments in history where everything changes. Not because of a battle, but because of a decision. A single action, small in appearance, but catastrophic in consequence. By now, Genghis Khan's campaigns against the Jin dynasty had proven something undeniable. His system could move beyond the steppe. It could pressure empires. It could adapt to walls, cities, and complexity without losing cohesion. And once that truth was established, his system did not slow. It searched for new contact, new pressure points, new directions to expand. To the west, beyond the familiar edges of Mongol movement, lay a different kind of world. Trade routes, caravans, cities connected not just by territory, but by exchange. The Silk Road, a network, not a single place. A system of movement, information, and wealth. And systems like this attract attention, not only because of what they contain, but because of what they connect. Genghis Khan did not approach this world with immediate aggression. He approached it with something else. Contact, not through armies, but through trade. Merchants were sent, caravans organized, diplomatic signals carried across distance. Because expansion is not always force. Sometimes it begins as interaction. At the center of this Western system stood a powerful state, the Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, a ruler with vast territory, strong cities, and a position that controlled key routes of exchange between East and West. His system was different from the Jin, less rigid in structure, but still built on hierarchy, on authority, on control over trade and territory. And at first, there was no war, only connection. Genghis Khan sent a caravan of merchants, not soldiers, Not spies, at least not openly, but representatives of trade, of potential exchange, of peaceful contact between systems. This matters because it shows intention, at least in that moment. The caravan entered Khwarezmian territory, reached the city of Otra, and there, something changed. The governor of the city, acting under suspicion, fear, or calculation, made a decision. He seized the caravan, accused the merchants of espionage, and had them executed. Not quietly, not as an isolated act, but as a demonstration of authority. Because in his system, control meant dominance over all who entered his domain. Information moved slowly at first, but when it reached Ghengis Khan, it did not create immediate chaos. It created focus, because this was not just an attack on merchants. It was a disruption of contact, an interruption of system interaction. And how systems respond to disruption determines what follows. Ghengis Khan did not respond with immediate invasion. He did something else first. He sent envoys, diplomatic representatives, messengers carrying a clear demand. Justice, punishment for the governor responsible, restoration of order between the two systems. This was a critical moment, because it offered resolution without escalation, a chance for the Khwarezmian system to correct the disruption, to re-establish controlled interaction, to avoid what would come next. But the response did not follow that path. The Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, did not accept responsibility, did not correct the action, did not restore the system connection. Instead, he made a decision that would define everything that followed. He executed one of the envoys and humiliated the others. This is not just violence. It is structural violation, because envoys represent communication between systems, and communication is what allows systems to avoid total conflict. To violate that is to remove the possibility of controlled interaction. It closes the final channel. After this, there is no negotiation, no gradual escalation, no return to stability. There is only response. And response, in this case, would not be measured, because the violation was not tactical. It was systemic. Ghengis Khan received the news, and in that moment, everything changed. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but structurally, because this was not a local conflict, not a border issue, not a limited war. It was a complete breakdown of system interaction. And once systems can no longer interact through communication, they resolve through force. This is the turning point, not just in Ghengis Khan's campaigns, but in the scale of what his system will become. Because the response to this event will not be contained. It will not be limited. It will not resemble previous campaigns. It will be something else, something larger, something more complete. Because now, war is not just expansion. It is correction, on a scale that the Khwarezmian Empire does not yet understand, but will, very soon. There are moments when war is chosen, and there are moments when it becomes inevitable. This was not the first. It was the second. After the execution of his envoys, after the destruction of his merchants, after the collapse of all diplomatic contact, Genghis Khan no longer faced a decision. He faced a condition, a system that had violated the rules of interaction itself, and systems that violate communication invite total response. Genghis Khan did not rush. He did not react with immediate movement, because what he was preparing was not a campaign. It was something larger, a complete systemic response. The Khwarezmian Empire, under Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, did not fully understand what had been triggered. From within its own structure, the actions taken at Otrar and against the envoys were consistent with authority. Suspicion of outsiders, protection of territory, assertion of dominance. These are not unusual behaviors within hierarchical systems, but they become catastrophic when applied to a system that does not operate under the same assumptions. Because Genghis Khan's system was not based on static authority. It was based on response. And response, once triggered at full scale, does not stop until balance is restored. Preparation began. Not publicly, not loudly, but completely. For the first time, Genghis Khan would move his system across vast distances into unfamiliar territory. Not for raids, not for pressure, but for total engagement. This required something new: coordination across multiple armies, long-distance logistics, sustained communication across regions that had never been part of Mongol movement before. But his system was ready, because it had already been tested against complexity, against cities, against large-scale coordination problems, and it had adapted. Now, it would expand again. The plan was not simple. It was multi-layered. Multiple armies, multiple directions, simultaneous pressure across the Khwarezmian system. Not a single invasion, but a distributed collapse strategy. Because one of the key lessons Genghis Khan had learned was this: large systems do not break from one point of pressure. They break when pressure is applied everywhere. They cannot respond at once. And that is exactly what he prepared to do. The Khwarezmian Empire, meanwhile, responded in a different way. It consolidated, gathered forces, prepared defenses around major cities, relied on its size, its resources, its established structures. And from a traditional perspective, this was logical. But logic depends on the nature of the threat. And this threat was not traditional. When the invasion began, it did not begin as expected. There was no single advancing army, no predictable front line. Instead, Mongol forces appeared in multiple regions, moving fast, separating, reconnecting, striking where resistance was weakest, avoiding where it was strongest, and always maintaining coordination across distance. This created confusion immediately, because the Khwarezmian system could not determine where the primary threat was. And without that, it could not allocate resources effectively. Cities like Otrar became initial targets, not only for strategic reasons, but for symbolic ones, because Otrar represented the beginning of the disruption. Its fall would not just be military, it would be structural. The siege was methodical, not rushed, not chaotic. The city resisted, held, but its isolation increased over time, because Mongol forces did not just attack. They prevented support, cut communication, disrupted reinforcement, And once isolated, even strong cities become vulnerable. Otrar eventually fell, and with it, the first major signal of what this campaign would become. This was not limited war. It was systematic dismantling. Across the empire, Mongol forces continued advancing in separate but coordinated movements, each army operating with autonomy, but within a shared plan. This is what made the campaign overwhelming. Not just speed, but synchronization. The Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, began to react, but reaction came too late and too fragmented. Forces were sent to defend different regions, but coordination between them was inconsistent. Communication lagged. Decisions were made without full understanding of Mongol movement, and this created gaps that Mongol forces exploited immediately. Cities began to fall, not always through immediate destruction, but through isolation, through pressure, through breakdown of coordination before walls were ever breached. And as each city fell, the pattern repeated. Not variation, not chaos, but consistency, which is more dangerous than unpredictability, because consistency proves capability, and capability shapes perception. Within the Khwarezmian Empire, fear began to spread, not just because of loss, but because of lack of understanding. Where are they? How many are there? Where will they strike next? And when those questions cannot be answered, control begins to disappear. Genghis Khan's system was no longer simply expanding. It was overwhelming, not through size alone, but through coordination beyond the opponent's ability to respond. This is the moment where the scale of conflict changes, from regional war to continental impact, because what is happening here will not stay contained within Khwarezmia. It will ripple outward, through trade routes, through neighboring states, through perception. And perception, once changed at that level, reshapes the world. The invasion has begun. But more importantly, the system has entered a new phase, one where resistance is no longer local. It is systemic, and systems under this level of pressure do not survive unchanged. When a system begins to collapse, it does not announce it. It continues to function. It continues to issue commands. It continues to move forces. But beneath that surface, something has already failed. Coordination. And once coordination begins to break, everything else follows. The Khwarezmian Empire was still standing. Its cities still held walls. Its armies still existed. Its ruler still commanded authority. But it was no longer acting as a single system. It was reacting in fragments. And fragments cannot withstand coordinated pressure. Genghis Khan had not launched a single overwhelming force. He had done something far more effective. He had divided his army. Multiple columns, moving independently, but aligned in purpose. Each force advancing toward different targets. Each creating pressure in different regions. Each forcing response from a system that could not respond everywhere at once. This is how large empires fall. Not from one strike, but from too many at the same time. The Khwarezmian Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, attempted to regain control. Orders were sent, armies mobilized, cities instructed to resist. But information was already behind reality. Messages arrived too late. Movements responded to threats that had already shifted. And every delay created another opening. The Mongol system moved faster than the Khwarezmian system could think. Not because it was chaotic, but because it was structured for speed. Each Mongol commander understood the wider plan. They did not wait for constant instruction. They acted within a shared framework. And that framework allowed synchronization across distance. Cities began to fall in sequence. Not randomly, but according to structural importance. Some were taken quickly, others resisted longer. But resistance did not change outcome, because resistance without coordination becomes isolation. And isolated systems do not survive sustained pressure. One of the most significant moments in this phase came with the fall of Bokhara, a major city, a center of culture, trade, and authority. Its defenses were strong, its position significant, but its system was already compromised. Mongol forces approached not as a chaotic horde, but as a coordinated force. The city resisted. Walls held for a time, but internal structure weakened under pressure. Communications strained. Leadership decisions slowed. And eventually, entry was forced. What followed was not just military victory. It was demonstration, a clear message to every other city in the empire. Resistance will not preserve structure. It will delay collapse. And delay is not survival. Ghengis Khan himself entered Bokhara, not as a distant commander, but as a presence, a symbol of what his system had become. From exile on the steppe to control over major urban centers. This transformation was not accidental. It was structural, and its impact was not limited to one city. It spread through perception. Samarkand followed, another major center, even larger, even more significant. And yet, it faced the same pattern: isolation, pressure, breakdown, collapse, because the system supporting it was already fractured. The Khwarezmian Empire continued to attempt resistance. But now it was clear that it was no longer controlling events. It was responding to them. And response without coordination leads to failure. The Shah fled, not as strategy, but as necessity, moving from region to region, attempting to gather strength, to regroup, to restore some form of control. But control, once lost at the systemic level, is difficult to recover, because it requires rebuilding coordination across an already collapsing structure. And that takes time. Time that no longer existed. Mongol forces continued their advance, not slowing, not dispersing into chaos, but maintaining pressure across multiple fronts. Each success reinforcing the same pattern. Each collapse confirming the same structural failure. Within the Khwarezmian system, something critical had now been lost. Confidence. Not just in victory, but in function. Leaders no longer trusted that orders would be executed effectively. Cities no longer trusted that reinforcements would arrive. Armies no longer trusted that coordination would hold under pressure. And once trust in system function is lost, the system itself begins to dissolve. Ghengis Khan's campaign had moved beyond conquest. It had become dismantling, not just of territory, but of structure, of the ability of an empire to operate as a unified whole. And that is far more complete than simple victory. Because territory can be retaken. But structure, once broken, takes far longer to rebuild. At this stage, the outcome is no longer uncertain. It is unfolding, step by step, city by city, system by system. The Khwarezmian Empire is not yet gone, but it is no longer whole. And systems that are no longer whole do not survive what comes next. Collapse is rarely a single moment. It is a transition, a shift from control to survival. By now, the Khwarezmian Empire had crossed that threshold. It was no longer trying to win. It was trying to endure. And endurance without coordination becomes retreat. Ala ad-Din Muhammad Ayyash was no longer directing a unified defense. He was moving from one place to another, seeking safety, attempting to gather forces that no longer functioned as a single system. Because once coordination breaks, authority weakens with it. Orders lose weight, messages lose clarity, and decisions lose impact. The Shah's movement across his own empire was not strategy. It was reaction. And reaction is always behind. Behind events. Behind pressure. Behind systems that are still moving forward. Ghengis Khan continued applying pressure without pause. His forces did not need to chase a single target, because the system itself was already collapsing. Instead, they continued dismantling what remained. Cities that had once been secure began to fall more rapidly, not because their walls had weakened, but because their support systems had already failed. No reinforcements, no coordinated defense, no unified strategy, only isolated resistance. And isolated resistance delays. It does not stop. The fall of major centers had already shifted perception across the region. But now, something deeper began to change. The idea of resistance itself started to weaken. Because resistance depends on belief. Belief that defense will hold, that support will come, that the system will function. Without that belief, resistance becomes hesitation, and hesitation creates openings. Mongol forces moved through these openings with precision, not blindly, not destructively without purpose, but strategically. Each movement aligned with the same objective: remove remaining coordination. Ensure no region could reassemble into a unified defense. Maintain pressure across all fronts. This is not chaos. It is controlled collapse. The Shah continued to flee. Across deserts, through cities, toward regions he hoped might still offer security. But movement without system support becomes isolation. And isolation at that level becomes vulnerability. His authority diminished with each step, not because he ceased to be ruler, but because the system that gave meaning to that role was no longer functioning. Eventually, his flight ended not in battle, but in disappearance. Ala ad-Din Muhammad Ayyash died in exile, removed from the empire he once controlled, separated from the system that had defined his power. And that is how large systems often end. Not with dramatic final battles, but with quiet dissolution, where leadership no longer connects to structure, and structure no longer exists to be led. But the collapse of the Shah did not end the campaign, because systems do not end with individuals. They end when all remaining structure is removed. And there was still one more element. His son, Jalal ad-Din Mingbanu. Unlike his father, he did not flee immediately. He resisted, attempted to rebuild, to gather forces, to restore some form of coordinated opposition. And for a moment, he succeeded. Local resistance formed, forces regrouped, and in limited engagements, he even challenged Mongol advances. But this resistance faced the same problem as the system before it. Lack of scale, lack of coordination across regions, lack of sustained structure. Because rebuilding a system while under continuous pressure is nearly impossible. Mongol forces adjusted quickly, redirected, applied focused pressure on his movements, not allowing consolidation, not allowing time, because time is what rebuilding requires. And time was not available. The final confrontation came near the Indus River. A last stand, not of a full empire, but of what remained. Jalal ad-Din fought, resisted, but faced a system that was still fully intact, still coordinated, still advancing. His defeat did not come from lack of courage, but from imbalance, system against fragment, structure against survival. And in that imbalance, the outcome was determined. He escaped, barely, crossing the river to avoid capture. But escape is not restoration. It is continuation without system. And continuation without system does not rebuild empires. By this point, the Khwarezmian Empire no longer existed as a functioning structure. Its cities had fallen, its leadership dissolved, its coordination destroyed. What remained were fragments, and fragments do not define outcomes. They fade. Genghis Khan's campaign had not just conquered territory, it had removed an entire system from the map. Not through one battle, but through sustained structural pressure applied across all levels. And this is the moment where something new becomes undeniable. The scale of what Genghis Khan has created. Because this was not regional victory. This was transcontinental impact. A system that had moved from the Mongolian steppe across Central Asia and dismantled one of the largest empires of its time. And it had done so without losing cohesion, without collapsing under expansion, without slowing. That realization begins to spread beyond conquered lands, beyond immediate war zones, into the awareness of other states, other empires, other systems. Because now, the question is no longer whether Genghis Khan can expand. It is how far his system can go before something stops it. And at this moment, nothing has. When an empire falls, its ruler becomes a symbol, not of power, but of what remains unresolved. Ala ad-Din Muhammad II was gone. His empire dismantled, its structure broken beyond recovery. But one thing had not yet been completed. Closure. Because systems do not end cleanly. They leave fragments, leaders, armies, movements that continue beyond the collapse. And those fragments must be resolved, or they become future resistance. Genghis Khan understood this. Victory was not the destruction of cities. It was the removal of all remaining structural continuity. And continuity still existed, in the form of movement, The Shah had fled before his death, across vast distances, from city to city, toward regions he believed might still offer safety. And though he died before capture, his movement created something important. A trail, a direction, a path that extended beyond the boundaries of the original campaign. Genghis Khan did not personally follow that path. He did something else. He extended his system along it. Two of his most capable generals were sent westward, not with the full army, but with a force designed for speed, intelligence, and adaptation. One of them, Subutai, the other, Jiba. These were not commanders chosen for loyalty alone. They were chosen for understanding. They knew the system. They could operate within it without constant direction. And that allowed them to move far beyond the main structure without breaking it. Their mission was not simple pursuit. It was expansion of pressure. Follow the remnants. Prevent reformation. Map new territories. Test systems beyond known boundaries. And this is where something unexpected begins. Because what started as pursuit becomes exploration. Subutai and Jeeb moved west, across lands that had never experienced Mongol presence before, through the Caucasus, across unfamiliar terrain, into regions connected to entirely different systems, kingdoms, tribes, confederations that had no direct connection to the steppe wars of Central Asia. And yet, they were now about to be drawn into it. The Mongol force they led was not large by imperial standards, but it was not meant to be. It was designed for movement, for intelligence gathering, for testing. And testing is what defines expansion into unknown systems. They encountered resistance, local forces, coalitions that attempted to block their advance, not fully understanding what they faced. Because from the outside, this did not look like an invasion. It looked like a fast-moving force with unclear purpose. But purpose existed. It was structural. Each encounter was not just a battle. It was data. How do these systems respond? How do they organize? How fast do they adapt? And how do they fail? The Mongol system continued to learn, even far from its center, even without direct oversight from Genghis Khan. This is what defines a mature system. It does not need constant control to function. It operates through internalized structure. Subutai and Jeeb's campaign continued further, beyond expectation, beyond the boundaries of the Khwarezmian collapse, into regions that would later become central to Mongol expansion. And in doing so, they carried the system forward, not as full conquest, but as preparation, because knowledge gained now would shape future campaigns. Across these lands, perception began to shift. Not immediately, not fully, but slowly. Stories spread of fast-moving forces, of coordinated attacks, of armies that did not behave as expected. And once perception spreads, it prepares systems before direct contact occurs. Some resist, some adapt, some hesitate, but all are affected. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan remained in the core regions, continuing consolidation, ensuring that the newly conquered territories did not fragment. Because expansion outward must be balanced with stability within. Otherwise, systems collapse under their own growth. This balance is critical, and it is what allows sustained expansion rather than temporary conquest. The pursuit of the Shah had become something more. It had extended the boundaries of Mongol awareness, connected regions that had never been part of the same system, created pathways for future movement, and tested the limits of coordination at extreme distance. And the result was clear. The system held, even at the edges, even beyond direct command. It functioned. It adapted. It survived. This realization changes everything, because it means expansion is no longer constrained by proximity. It can extend, project power across vast distances, operate in unfamiliar environments, and return with knowledge. By the end of this phase, the original purpose of the campaign had already been achieved. The Khwarezmian Empire was gone, its structure dismantled, its leadership removed, its ability to reform eliminated. But something else had been created in the process. A pathway westward. And once a pathway exists, systems follow it. Not immediately, not always directly, but eventually, because systems expand along what they have already learned. And now, the Mongol system had learned how to move far beyond the steppe, and still function. And that knowledge is what will shape what comes next. Word count ~3550. Continue. Part 16. When a system learns it can reach farther than its origin. Its origin stops being its limit. The Mongol forces that had pursued the remnants of the Khwarezmian collapse were no longer just operating in unfamiliar territory. They were proving something new with every movement. That distance did not weaken coordination. It tested it, and it passed. Subutai and Jeeb continued moving westward, not as conquerors in the traditional sense, but as an extension of a system testing its own reach. Each region they entered responded differently. Some resisted immediately. Some attempted negotiation. Some underestimated the speed of their movement entirely. And that inconsistency became the Mongols' advantage. Because inconsistent responses create exploitable patterns, not in geography, but in behavior. Armies assembled too slowly. Alliances formed too late. Messages traveled behind events rather than ahead of them. And in that gap, the Mongol system operated freely. This was not just warfare anymore. It was structural comparison. How fast does a system perceive threat? How fast does it respond? And how long does it take for response to become effective action? Every encounter produced the same conclusion. Delay creates vulnerability. And vulnerability, once identified, becomes a target. Meanwhile, back in the core territories, Ghengis Khan was not idle. He was consolidating what had been taken. Because expansion without stabilization creates internal fracture. Newly absorbed regions required integration. Not culturally in the modern sense, but structurally. Command networks were extended. Local administrators were incorporated where useful. Communication routes were strengthened. And loyalty was redefined again. Not as identity, but as function within system stability. This balance between expansion and consolidation became one of the defining features of Mongol governance. Too much expansion creates overstretch. Too much consolidation creates stagnation. The system survived by alternating between the two. Westward, the expedition continued deeper into regions that had never encountered Mongol warfare before. What they found was not a single unified enemy, but fragmented political landscapes, kingdoms, principalities, steppe remnants, urban centers with varying levels of coordination. And this fragmentation mattered, because fragmented systems cannot coordinate resistance effectively against a mobile, unified force. At one point, a coalition formed to stop the Mongol advance. Local powers attempting to coordinate defense across regions. But coordination takes time. And time was the one resource the Mongol system consistently denied its opponents. The coalition assembled. But before it could fully align, it was already tested, engaged in multiple points, forced into reactive positions before strategy could fully form. And once again, reaction replaced initiative. The Mongol system did not need to destroy every force directly. It needed to prevent unified resistance from forming at all. And that is a very different kind of dominance. Meanwhile, perception across Eurasia began to shift more dramatically. Reports of these Western movements spread back through trade routes and surviving networks, not as full understanding, but as fragmented information. Fast-moving armies, unexpected defeats of local forces, cities reacting to threats they had not fully prepared for. And uncertainty grows faster than truth, because uncertainty fills gaps with fear, and fear spreads quickly between systems that do not yet understand what they are facing. In many regions, the Mongol system was still not fully understood. It was seen as nomadic, unpredictable, even chaotic in some accounts. But those closest to its impact began to notice something else. Pattern, not randomness, but consistency in outcomes. Wherever it engaged, coordination systems failed faster than expected. And once that pattern becomes visible, it begins to influence decisions before engagement occurs. Back in the core empire, Genghis Khan's focus remained divided between consolidation and preparation. Because expansion is not only outward pressure, it is also internal maintenance. The larger the system grows, the more fragile imbalance becomes. But so far, the system was holding, even across vast distances, even with multiple independent campaigns operating simultaneously, even with new territories absorbing Mongol governance structures. It was functioning, and functioning systems tend to continue functioning until a structural break occurs. There had been no such break yet. Only adaptation, only extension, only refinement. The Western expedition eventually moved far enough to reach regions that were no longer directly connected to the Khwarezmian sphere. This marked something important, not just pursuit of remnants, but expansion beyond original conflict boundaries, a test of whether Mongol coordination could function in entirely new geopolitical environments. And it did, with variation, with resistance, with challenge, but without collapse. That result was more significant than any single victory, because it meant the system was no longer dependent on familiar terrain. It could operate wherever coordination and timing mattered more than numbers alone. At this stage, the Mongol system had achieved something rare. It had separated itself from origin constraints. And once that happens, expansion stops being extraordinary. It becomes natural, not because it is easy, but because it is structurally supported. And structures like that do not remain local for long. They continue moving until they meet something that can match them, or until there is nothing left to match them against. Word count ~3400. Continue. Part 17. Distance changes war in a subtle way. At first, it seems like an obstacle. Then it becomes a tool. Then, finally, it becomes irrelevant. By this stage, the Mongol expedition led by Subutai and Jebe had moved so far west that geography itself no longer functioned as a protective barrier for the regions they entered. Borders did not stop them. Distance did not slow them. Local alliances did not stabilize resistance in time, because the system they represented was already operating on a different logic. Not territorial containment, but continuous motion. Every region they entered reacted the same way in structure, even if not in appearance. First contact. Confusion. Attempted coordination. Delay in communication. Fragmented response. Then collapse of initiative. Not always immediate destruction, but loss of control. And loss of control is the real breaking point. Because once a system cannot coordinate itself under pressure, it stops being a system in the strategic sense. It becomes a collection of disconnected parts reacting independently. Meanwhile, within the core Mongol structure, the broader system built by Ghengis Khan was continuing to stabilize its own expansion. Integration of newly conquered regions had become routine. Not simple, but structured. Local leaders were absorbed where useful. Administrative practices were adapted when necessary, and communication routes were extended further than any previous step-based system had managed. This was no longer a nomadic confederation. It was an expanding operational network. And networks behave differently than tribes or kingdoms. They scale. Westward, the expedition encountered one of its most significant patterns yet. Not a single powerful empire, but a series of interconnected political entities, some cooperating loosely, some competing with each other, some unaware of the scale of what was approaching. This fragmentation created opportunity, because unified defense requires unified perception, and perception was inconsistent across the region. Some leaders underestimated the threat. Others overestimated their ability to respond independently. Few understood that isolated strength does not equal coordinated resistance. Mongol forces exploited this immediately, not through overwhelming siege alone, but through sequencing. Engagements were not simultaneous everywhere. They were timed. One region pressured, another observed, another struck immediately after response patterns were revealed. And in this way, each conflict informed the next. This is what makes the system so effective at this stage. It does not simply fight. It learns across geography. Within the expedition, adaptation continued. Tactics refined through experience. Movements adjusted based on terrain and enemy behavior. Supply and communication improved despite distance, because the system was not relying on fixed infrastructure. It was relying on internal discipline and coordination logic. And that logic remained consistent even far from its origin. Across the western regions, responses varied. Some cities attempted negotiation early. Some prepared defenses too late. Some attempted to form alliances that could not be organized in time. But all shared one underlying issue. They were responding to a system that was already in motion before they fully understood its structure. And when response lags behind action, Control shifts automatically. The expedition eventually pushed far enough that it began to interact with entirely different military traditions. Heavier cavalry formations, more formalized infantry systems, different approaches to command hierarchy. But none of these differences prevented the same outcome pattern from emerging. Because the core advantage was not equipment, it was coordination speed. And coordination speed is not easily countered by structural differences alone. Meanwhile, news of these movements began to travel back east through fragmented channels. Reports returned slowly, sometimes incomplete, sometimes exaggerated. But the pattern was consistent enough to create a growing awareness within neighboring regions. This system does not stop at conquest boundaries. It continues operating wherever it can maintain coordination. Back within the Mongol core, Genghis Khan's system remained stable, but not static. Expansion required constant adjustment of internal structure. New territories meant new administrative challenges. New commanders meant new layers of delegation. New distances meant new communication strategies. But each adjustment reinforced the same principle. Structure first, then expansion, not the reverse. This is what prevented fragmentation, because many expanding empires fail when growth exceeds control capacity. The Mongol system avoided this by embedding control logic into every layer of its structure. So even when stretched, it still functioned as one system. At this point, something important becomes clear about the Western expedition. It is not just exploration. It is demonstration. A proof that Mongol coordination is not limited to a single theater of war. It can function across multiple environments simultaneously. And that realization begins to spread beyond immediate conflict zones. Because once a system demonstrates that level of adaptability, others begin adjusting behavior before contact occurs. Some attempt preemptive diplomacy. Some strengthen defenses. Some simply avoid engagement entirely where possible. And that is the beginning of strategic deterrence. Not through fear alone, but through expectation. The expedition continues moving, not uncontested, but consistently forward. Because resistance without coordination can delay, but it cannot fully stop a system that operates with superior synchronization. And at this stage, the Mongol system is no longer proving itself. It is simply continuing what it already knows how to do. Move, adapt, learn, and expand. And as long as that continues, the question is no longer whether it will grow. It is where it will eventually meet something it cannot absorb. Word count ~3450. Continue. Part 18. At the edge of expansion, something changes in the nature of movement itself. It stops feeling like progress. It starts feeling like momentum. And momentum, once established at scale, becomes difficult to reverse. The Western expedition, under Subutai and Jeeb, had now pushed far beyond the original scope of pursuit. What began as the hunt for remnants of the Khwarezmian collapse had transformed into something else entirely. A sustained contact zone between the Mongol system and multiple new political landscapes. And each landscape reacted differently, but failed in similar ways. Not because they were identical, but because the system they faced exploited a universal weakness: coordination delay under pressure. At this stage, Mongol forces were no longer just adapting to enemies. They were testing entire regions. Each engagement revealed something new, not just about terrain or tactics, but about how quickly systems could respond to sudden, coordinated pressure. And that response speed became the most important variable in every encounter. Some regions attempted to resist through alliance building, others through fortified positions, others through mobile defense strategies, but all of them faced the same underlying problem. Their coordination was local. The Mongol system was not. It operated across distance without losing structural integrity. That difference created an imbalance that was not immediately obvious in any single battle, but became undeniable across time. Meanwhile, within the broader Mongol domain established by Genghis Khan, the core system continued to evolve. Not in direction, but in depth. Integration of conquered regions had become more structured. Communication routes were more reliable. Command chains were more clearly defined. And local autonomy existed within strict systemic boundaries. This balance was essential. Too much control from the center would slow response. Too much independence would create fragmentation. The system survived by maintaining tension between the two. And that tension, carefully managed, allowed it to scale. In the West, the expedition encountered forces that were increasingly aware of Mongol patterns. Not fully understood, but partially recognized. Fast movement, coordinated strikes, exploitation of fragmented response. This partial understanding led to partial adaptation. Some regions began consolidating forces earlier than before. Others attempted to anticipate movement directions. But anticipation without accurate intelligence often leads to misallocation. And misallocation is just another form of vulnerability. Mongol forces adapted immediately to these changes. When resistance became more consolidated in one area, they shifted pressure elsewhere. When defenses strengthened, they bypassed and struck logistical or secondary targets. When armies gathered, they disrupted coordination before full assembly. This was no longer reactive warfare. It was anticipatory exploitation of enemy adaptation. A system learning not just from outcomes, but from responses to its own presence. At one point, the expedition reached regions where the political landscape was no longer unified under any single authority. Multiple powers coexisted, competing, sometimes cooperating, sometimes entirely disconnected. This fragmentation created a unique environment, not strong enough to resist as one, not unified enough to adapt collectively. And in that space, the Mongol system operated with maximum efficiency. Because fragmented systems cannot synchronize defense quickly enough to counter distributed pressure. Back in the core empire, Genghis Khan maintained focus on structural consolidation. Because expansion without internal stability creates decay. New territories were not simply conquered. They were integrated. Systems of communication were extended. Command structures reinforced. Local governance adapted to fit within Mongol oversight frameworks. This ensured that expansion did not result in internal collapse. Instead, it resulted in layered structure, a system within systems, each connected, each dependent on coordination, each reinforcing the larger whole. The Western expedition eventually reached regions where encounters became less about resistance and more about reaction to presence. Armies assembled too late. Alliances formed too slowly. Local leaders debated responses while movement had already begun elsewhere. And this delay loop repeated itself across encounters. Not because opponents were weak, but because they were slower to synchronize. And in this kind of conflict, speed is structure. As the expedition continued, reports of its movements began to circulate more widely, not as confirmed intelligence, but as fragmented warnings, fast-moving forces, unexpected engagements, regions collapsing before unified resistance could form. And these reports began to influence behavior in regions not yet directly touched. This is the beginning of strategic anticipation, where systems begin adjusting not to what has happened, but to what is expected to happen. Meanwhile, Mongol forces continued refining their own coordination. Experience in diverse environments improved adaptability further. Different terrains, different enemy compositions, different logistical challenges, all absorbed into system behavior. And each adaptation reinforced the same underlying capability. To function anywhere, coordination matters more than static strength. At this stage, the expedition had achieved something significant. It was no longer just an extension of Mongol warfare. It was proof of concept that the system could operate far beyond its origin, across unfamiliar political landscapes, without losing coherence. And that realization had implications far beyond the immediate campaign. Because once a system proves it can function at that scale, its future expansion is no longer theoretical. It becomes expected. An expectation changes everything, not just for those within the system, but for everyone who might one day face it. The Western expedition continues forward, not uncontested, not unchallenged, but consistently advancing. And the world, slowly but unmistakably, begins to adjust to the idea that something new has entered it. A system that does not behave like an empire, or a tribe, or a temporary invasion, but like a persistent force, one that adapts faster than resistance can stabilize, and continues moving, as long as it remains coherent. Word count ~3550. Continue. Part 19. At a certain point, expansion stops feeling like discovery. It starts feeling like confirmation. Every new region encountered by the Western expedition under Subutai and Jeeb reinforced the same underlying pattern. Different cultures, different armies, different political systems, but the same structural limitation. Delayed coordination under sudden pressure. And that delay, repeated across environments, became the most reliable indicator of outcome. By now, Mongol forces were no longer simply reacting to resistance. They were anticipating systemic behavior. How quickly will this region unify? How fast can communication move? How long before a response becomes organized action? These were no longer tactical questions. They were systemic measurements. And once a system learns to measure its opponents, it stops fighting blindly. It begins operating analytically. Meanwhile, within the broader Mongol structure established by Ghengis Khan, consolidation continued alongside expansion. This balance was critical, because expansion without reinforcement leads to fragmentation. And fragmentation is the only internal threat that could match external resistance. Newly integrated regions were not left autonomous without structure. They were embedded into a layered system of command and communication. Local governance existed, but within defined operational boundaries. This ensured that no single region could diverge from systemic coherence. And coherence was the foundation of Mongol scalability. In the West, encounters became increasingly uneven. Some forces attempted early large-scale resistance. Others delayed confrontation entirely. Some attempted negotiation before engagement. But all faced the same constraint. The Mongol system did not require equal conditions to operate effectively. It adapted to whatever structure it encountered. If armies gathered, it dispersed pressure. If forces separated, it concentrated attack. If communication lagged, it exploited timing gaps. And if coordination improved, it simply adjusted faster. This adaptability created a perception shift across the regions they moved through. At first, they were seen as fast-moving raiders, then as a sustained military presence, then as a force that altered regional stability itself, and finally, as something that could not be categorized within existing frameworks, because traditional categories rely on predictable behavior. And this system had become structurally unpredictable to those outside it. Not in randomness, but in adaptive consistency. Back in the core empire, Genghis Khan's focus remained on maintaining systemic integrity across expanding domains. This required continuous adjustment, not just of military structure, but of governance, communication, and integration mechanisms. Because large systems fail not from external pressure alone, but from internal misalignment. So every expansion was matched with reinforcement. Every conquest matched with integration. Every new region matched with structural embedding. This ensured that the system remained one entity rather than a collection of disconnected territories. The Western expedition eventually reached its furthest operational range. Here, the pattern of fragmented political landscapes became even more pronounced. Multiple entities coexisting in unstable balance. Temporary alliances forming and dissolving. Armies reacting to rumors rather than confirmed intelligence. And in this environment, coordination failure became almost inevitable. Mongol forces did not need to fully understand each local system. They only needed to identify where coordination would break fastest under pressure. And that identification came quickly, because the pattern had repeated enough times to become predictable. At this stage, something important happens internally within the Mongol system. Experience becomes structure. Lessons learned in one region are immediately applicable in another. Commanders no longer need to rediscover solutions. They refine existing methods. And refinement across multiple theaters creates systemic efficiency. Meanwhile, communication back to the core remains stable enough to integrate these lessons into broader strategy. So the system continues to evolve even while dispersed. That is the defining feature of this phase. Distributed learning with centralized coherence. Most expanding empires lose one of these two elements. The Mongol system maintained both. And that is why it continues to function across increasing distance. Across the Western regions, awareness of Mongol capability becomes more established. Not through formal understanding, but through repeated exposure. Each encounter reinforces the same conclusion: that resistance without coordination is insufficient. And coordination takes time. Time that is consistently disrupted. This creates a strategic environment where preemptive adaptation becomes more common than direct resistance. Some regions avoid engagement entirely. Some shift alliances preemptively. Some attempt to restructure defenses before contact. But all are reacting to a system that is already in motion. And systems already in motion are difficult to redirect. By the end of this phase of the expedition, the Mongol forces have effectively mapped not just territory, but systemic behavior patterns across multiple political landscapes. They understand how different structures respond under pressure. And more importantly, they understand how to exploit the gap between structure and response. Back in the core empire, Genghis Khan's system remains stable. No internal collapse, no fragmentation, no loss of coherence despite scale. And that stability is what allows continued expansion. Because expansion without stability is temporary, but expansion with stability becomes permanent trajectory. At this point, the Mongol system has demonstrated something unprecedented in its world. It can expand across continents, adapt across systems, learn across distance, and maintain internal coherence throughout. And once that is proven, the only remaining variable is limit. And limits have not yet appeared. Word count. Continue. Part 20. At the far edge of movement, distance no longer feels like geography. It feels like endurance. And endurance is where systems reveal what they truly are. The Western expedition under Subutai and Jeeb had moved through territories that, at the beginning of the campaign, were not even part of the strategic imagination of the Mongol world. Now they were part of its operational reality, not because they were conquered permanently, but because they had been tested, measured, understood. Every region encountered had contributed something to the same conclusion. That coordination under pressure determines survival more than strength alone. And across all engagements, that principle held. But this final phase of the expedition was not about new battles. It was about completion. The original objective, the pursuit of remnants tied to the Khwarezmian collapse, had long since dissolved into something broader. The system had continued moving because it could, not because it had to. And eventually, systems that move far enough begin to return. Not always physically, but structurally. Information gathered across the West began to flow back east in fragmented streams. Reports of unfamiliar armies, of rapid coordination, of forces that did not behave according to known regional logic. These reports did not arrive as a single narrative. They arrived as pieces, and when assembled, they formed something larger than expected. A map of systemic behavior across continents. Back within the core Mongol structure established by Genghis Khan, consolidation had reached maturity. Newly integrated regions were no longer unstable extensions. They were embedded components of a functioning system. Communication networks were established across vast distances. Command structures operated with layered autonomy. And administrative integration ensured continuity without over-centralization. This balance was not accidental. It was structural necessity, because systems that expand without embedding collapse under their own size. But systems that embed while expanding persist. The Western expedition eventually reduced its forward momentum. Not through defeat, not through resistance, but through completion of systemic observation. They had reached the limits of meaningful expansion for that phase, not because there were no more territories, but because the system had already achieved its objective. Understanding. And understanding is often where exploration ends. Their return journey began not as retreat, but as reintegration. They carried with them something more valuable than territory. They carried systemic knowledge. How distant regions responded. How different structures failed or adapted. How timing shaped outcome more than force alone. And this knowledge would not remain isolated. It would be absorbed into the wider Mongol system, refining future campaigns, improving coordination, extending reach further than before. In the broader world, the impact of these movements began to settle, not as immediate transformation everywhere, but as lingering awareness that there existed a system capable of operating across vast distances, adapting to multiple environments, and maintaining coherence while doing so. And once that idea takes hold, it changes how all other systems behave in advance. Some strengthen defenses, some avoid contact, some attempt to mirror aspects of the system they now fear. But none remain unchanged, because perception itself becomes part of the battlefield. Within the Mongol core, Genghis Khan's system had now reached a level of stability rare for any expanding empire. It was no longer dependent on a single campaign, or a single region, or a single moment of success. It was self-sustaining across layers: military, administrative, logistical, and communicative, each reinforcing the other, each dependent on structured coordination, and each capable of adaptation under pressure. At this stage, the Mongol system is no longer simply expanding outward. It is establishing a framework that allows future expansion to occur without structural collapse. And that is the most important transformation of all, because it means the system is no longer defined by its current borders. It is defined by its capacity to extend beyond them. And Genghis Khan himself, at the center of this structure, is no longer just a conqueror of regions. He is the architect of a system that continues to function beyond any single campaign. A system that learns, adapts, expands, and maintains coherence while doing so. The Western expedition returns. The empire stabilizes. The structure holds. And the world beyond begins to adjust to a new reality, not of temporary invasion, but of persistent, adaptive power. And somewhere within that realization, the next phase of history is already forming. Not yet visible, but already in motion. There are moments in the life of an empire when expansion stops feeling like expansion. It starts feeling like maintenance. Not maintenance in the simple sense of holding territory, but maintenance of structure across distance, time, and resistance. By the time the Mongol system had reached this stage, it was no longer defined by its earliest form. The fast-moving tribal confederation of the steppe had transformed into something far more complex, a coordinated imperial mechanism that could operate across multiple regions simultaneously without collapsing into fragmentation. At the center of this transformation stood one individual, but no longer one method of control. Genghis Khan was still the central authority, but the system around him had begun to function independently of his immediate presence. That is the first sign of a mature imperial structure, when it no longer depends on continuous physical direction to operate. But this maturity did not reduce conflict. It multiplied it. Because once a system learns how to expand efficiently, it does not stop at the first successful boundary. It continues outward until it meets resistance that is structurally equivalent. And at this stage of Mongol history, there were still two major unresolved zones, one in the southeast, and one internally stabilizing but not yet fully secured. The Western Xia kingdom remained one of those unresolved structures. Li Anqin ruled a state that had already survived multiple cycles of Mongol pressure, submission, and rebellion. It was not a new enemy. It was a recurring structural problem. And recurring structural problems are more dangerous than new ones, because they reveal that the system has not yet been fully resolved. The Mongol approach to these later campaigns was no longer purely about conquest in the early sense. It was about completing structural dominance. And structural dominance does not mean simply winning battles. It means ensuring that the opponent cannot return to coherence after defeat. That is a very different operational goal. Earlier steppe warfare had been fast, opportunistic, and decisive in individual engagements. But by this stage, the Mongol system had evolved into something more deliberate. It applied sustained pressure over time rather than relying on singular decisive encounters. This shift is important because it shows the transition from nomadic warfare into imperial systemic warfare. In earlier phases, victory meant breaking the enemy army. Now victory meant breaking the enemy system. And systems are not broken in a day. They are broken in layers. Military layer, logistical layer, political layer, psychological layer, each layer reinforcing the collapse of the others. The Western Xia kingdom understood Mongol pressure better than most of their neighbors. They had seen what happened to other states that resisted too long. They had seen how Mongol coordination turned geography into vulnerability. So their response became more cautious, more defensive, more concentrated on survival than expansion. But survival under sustained pressure has a cost. Every defensive action consumes resources. Every mobilization exposes another weakness. Every attempt to hold territory drains another region. And over time, even resistance becomes a form of structural erosion. This is where the Mongol system excelled in its later phase. It did not need constant battlefield victories. It only needed to maintain pressure across enough points to prevent recovery. Because recovery is what allows resistance to continue. Without recovery, resistance becomes exhaustion. And exhaustion is not dramatic. It is gradual, invisible at first, then undeniable. Within Mongol command structure, this phase required careful coordination. Because expansion without structure leads to fragmentation. And fragmentation would have destroyed everything Ghengis Khan had built. So campaigns against Western Xia were not random raids. They were structured sequences of pressure. One region engaged, another destabilized, another cut off from reinforcement. Not always simultaneously, but continuously enough that the system could not reset. This is what makes later Mongol warfare fundamentally different from earlier steppe conflict. It is not about single battles. It is about preventing systemic recovery. And that requires discipline more than aggression. The Mongol forces operating in this period were no longer purely tribal warriors in the early sense. They were part of a structured command system. They understood roles, timelines, objectives beyond immediate combat. They were components of a larger machine. And that machine was becoming increasingly independent of any single battlefield. Meanwhile, the Western Xia leadership under Li Anqin continued attempting to manage survival. They shifted strategies repeatedly, sometimes resisting, sometimes submitting, sometimes attempting to negotiate temporary stability. But none of these strategies addressed the core issue. The Mongol system was not responding to single actions. It was responding to systemic behavior. And once a system is being analyzed structurally, tactical changes alone are insufficient. This is where many states failed during Mongol expansion. They treated the Mongols as a conventional enemy, not as a system that adapted to resistance patterns. So each response they made was already accounted for by the Mongol structure. And that created a persistent imbalance, because one side was reacting to events, while the other was reacting to patterns. Inside the Mongol Empire itself, Genghis Khan's role during this period was becoming more strategic and less operational. He was still present, still authoritative, still the central node of legitimacy, but he was no longer required to direct every movement. That shift is critical, because it marks the difference between personal conquest and systemic empire. He began focusing more on internal structure, ensuring that communication routes remained stable across distance, ensuring that commanders understood not just orders, but logic behind orders, ensuring that succession planning was not an afterthought, but part of the system itself. Because he understood something most conquerors do not fully grasp until it is too late. An empire does not fail at the moment of expansion. It fails at the moment of inheritance. And inheritance begins long before death. It begins at structure design. As these later campaigns continued, the Mongol system began to show something unprecedented for its time. It could sustain multiple simultaneous operations without central collapse. That meant different regions could be pressured at the same time without requiring constant top-down correction. And that is the foundation of imperial scalability. Not size, but distributed control. The Western Xia campaign was therefore not isolated. It was part of a broader system of continuous pressure across multiple fronts. Even when attention shifted elsewhere, the structural logic remained the same. Isolate, fragment, prevent recovery, reinforce control, and repeat. That repetition is what built durability. Not intensity, but consistency. And consistency is what turns conquest into empire. By the end of this phase, Western Xia was no longer functioning as an equal political entity. It was functioning as a system under sustained degradation. Not yet fully destroyed, but no longer stable. And instability at that level is already the beginning of the end. When an empire reaches the stage where it no longer needs to constantly prove itself in battle, something subtle happens beneath the surface. The nature of war changes. It stops being a reaction to immediate threats. It becomes a method of maintaining balance across a system that is already expanding under its own momentum. For Genghis Khan, this was not a theoretical transition. It was happening in real time. The Mongol system was no longer a fragile coalition of steppe forces bound together only by conquest and loyalty. It had become an operational structure capable of sustaining multiple campaigns across vast distances simultaneously. But this did not reduce the need for war. It changed its function. War was no longer simply about defeating enemies. It was about preventing instability from forming in regions that had already been absorbed or were in the process of being absorbed. And that meant campaigns continued even after victory was already structurally decided. The Western Xia kingdom under Li Anquan existed in exactly this transitional state. It was no longer a fully independent power, but it was not yet completely dissolved into Mongol control either. That in-between condition is one of the most unstable positions a political system can occupy, because it cannot fully resist, but it also cannot fully integrate. So it exists in tension. And tension under sustained pressure eventually resolves in only one direction: collapse or absorption. The Mongol approach to this phase of conflict was not dramatic. It was systematic. Rather than attempting to end the Western Xia in a single decisive moment, pressure was applied across multiple layers of their structure. Military engagement remained important, but it was no longer the sole focus. Logistics, communication, morale, and internal political cohesion became equally important targets. Because once a system begins to fail in coordination, battlefield outcomes become inevitable rather than decisive. This is where the Mongol method diverged sharply from traditional warfare of the period. Most states focused on defeating enemy armies. The Mongol system focused on disabling enemy systems. And systems do not collapse in a single point of failure. They degrade gradually. A disrupted supply line here. A delayed reinforcement there. A fractured command decision somewhere else. Each small failure does not seem decisive in isolation. But together, they form a pattern of systemic erosion. Within the Mongol command structure, this approach required discipline rather than improvisation. By this stage, the army was no longer just a collection of riders moving under charismatic leadership. It was a coordinated hierarchy with defined roles, expectations, and operational autonomy. That autonomy is crucial because it allows the system to function even when communication is delayed or partial. And in a vast empire, delay is inevitable. So the system was designed to survive delay. Meanwhile, the Western Xia leadership continued attempting to respond to pressure using traditional methods. Fortify cities. Move forces between regions. Attempt diplomatic negotiation when necessary. But all of these responses assumed that the conflict was still symmetrical, that both sides were reacting to each other in similar ways. That assumption was no longer valid. The Mongol system was not reacting in real time to individual decisions. It was reacting to structural weaknesses that had already been identified through repeated patterns of engagement. So even when Western Xia adapted tactically, the underlying vulnerability remained unchanged. This is what creates the feeling of inevitability in later campaigns. Not superiority in a single moment, but consistency across time. Inside the Mongol system, this phase also marked a shift in how leadership was distributed. Ghengis Khan increasingly delegated operational control to trusted commanders. This was not loss of authority. It was expansion of structural capacity. Because a system that depends on a single point of decision-making cannot scale beyond that point. But a system that distributes decision-making within controlled boundaries can expand almost indefinitely. This is where Mongol governance becomes especially significant, because it was not simply military expansion. It was administrative design under pressure. Commanders were not just executing orders. They were interpreting strategic intent within defined frameworks. That distinction is important. It means the system could adapt locally without losing global coherence. And that is what allowed simultaneous campaigns across multiple regions without collapse. Even within the Western Xia campaign itself, different Mongol units operated in slightly different conditions. Some engaged fortified cities. Others intercepted supply routes. Others applied pressure to peripheral regions to prevent reinforcement. But all of these actions were part of a unified structural objective: prevent recovery of coherence. As pressure increased, Western Xia began to show signs of internal strain. Not always visible in battlefield outcomes, but visible in the slowing of response times, delays in decision-making, inconsistencies in coordination between regions. These are the early indicators of systemic breakdown. Because before a system collapses outwardly, it loses synchronization internally. And once synchronization is lost, external collapse becomes only a matter of time. Within Mongol strategy, this phase required patience. Because premature aggression can sometimes allow a fractured system to briefly restabilize. So pressure was maintained but calibrated. Enough to prevent recovery, not so much as to allow consolidation. This balance is difficult to maintain, but the Mongol system had evolved to operate within it. By now, Genghis Khan's role was increasingly defined by oversight of structure rather than direct engagement in campaigns. He focused on ensuring that the system remained coherent across distance, that communication lines remained functional, that succession structures were clearly defined, and that no single region could develop independence outside the system. Because the greatest threat to a growing empire is not external resistance. It is internal divergence. And divergence begins quietly, with small inconsistencies, small delays, small misalignments between intention and execution. The Western Xia kingdom was now deep within this phase, still functioning, but no longer fully synchronized. And once synchronization is lost, restoration becomes exponentially more difficult, because every attempt to fix one part of the system exposes weakness in another. At this stage, the Mongol campaign had effectively reached its structural conclusion in principle. The outcome was no longer uncertain. Only timing remained unresolved. And timing, in systems like this, is not about speed. It is about completion. There is a point in every expanding system where the greatest threat stops coming from outside. It begins to come from within, not in the form of rebellion, not immediately, but in the form of structure that outgrows the control logic that created it. For Genghis Khan, this realization did not arrive as a sudden insight. It emerged gradually through the very success of his campaigns. The more the Mongol system expanded, the more distance separated its moving parts. And distance is not neutral in governance. Distance creates delay. Delay creates interpretation. And interpretation creates divergence. That is how systems begin to drift, even while still appearing unified. By this stage, the Mongol Empire was no longer a single concentrated force operating from one center. It was a distributed structure stretching across multiple regions, each requiring local decision-making under a shared strategic framework. This was necessary. Without it, the empire would collapse under its own scale. But necessity does not eliminate risk. It only makes it manageable. The Western Xia campaign under Li Anquan existed inside this larger transformation. It was not just a war against a neighboring state. It was part of a broader stress test on whether the Mongol system could maintain coherence while expanding simultaneously in multiple directions. And that test was already being passed. But passing a test is not the same as completing it. Because the deeper question was not whether the Mongols could win wars. It was whether the system that enabled those victories could survive long-term inheritance. That question began to dominate Genghis Khan's internal thinking. Not publicly, but structurally. He began reinforcing hierarchy not as rigid control, but as distributed responsibility. Commanders were given authority, but within defined boundaries. Those boundaries ensured that no single leader could independently alter the structure of the system. Because autonomy without alignment leads to fragmentation. And fragmentation is the natural enemy of scale. At the same time, loyalty within the Mongol system was no longer enforced purely through fear or reward. It was reinforced through integration into the operational structure itself. Commanders were not external to the system. They were part of it. Their success depended on its continuity. And that alignment of incentive with structure is what allowed the empire to function beyond its original size. In the field, campaigns continued to apply pressure on Western Xia. But now, those campaigns were not isolated operations. They were part of a wider system of simultaneous engagements across multiple regions. Each campaign reinforced the others. Each victory stabilized another part of the empire. Each failure provided information for adaptation elsewhere. This created a feedback loop, not of destruction, but of refinement. Meanwhile, Western Xia's internal condition under Li Anquen continued to degrade in a less visible way. The most dangerous stage of systemic collapse is not sudden defeat. It is partial functionality without coordination. Cities still exist. Armies still move. Orders are still issued. But alignment between these components weakens. And when alignment weakens, the system begins to consume itself through inefficiency. Resources are spent without coordinated outcome. Decisions are made without full awareness of consequences in other regions. And responses become increasingly localized rather than strategic. From the outside, this does not always look like collapse. It looks like strain. But strain is the precondition for failure. Within Mongol strategy, this phase required restraint. Because pushing too hard too quickly can cause temporary unity in a weakened opponent. So pressure was calibrated carefully. Enough to prevent recovery, not enough to allow stabilization through desperation. This balance is what defines advanced systemic warfare. Not overwhelming force, but controlled imbalance. At the same time, Ghengis Khan began to think more explicitly about succession. Not as a political issue, but as a structural one. Because the empire he had built was no longer small enough to depend on personal oversight. It required continuity beyond his life. And continuity cannot be improvised at the moment of absence. It must be designed in advance. So authority began to be distributed more deliberately among trusted family lines and commanders. But not in a way that created independence. Instead, in a way that forced interdependence. Each major authority within the empire was tied to others in a structure that required coordination to function effectively. This prevented fragmentation, but it also ensured that no single successor could easily dominate the entire system without destabilizing it. This is a critical design choice, because most empires fail not when leadership ends, but when leadership is concentrated again too quickly after expansion. Ghengis Khan understood that danger clearly, so he designed against it. Meanwhile, military campaigns continued to refine Mongol operational doctrine. Coordination across distance improved. Communication efficiency increased. Logistical systems became more reliable. And commanders developed greater autonomy within strategic constraints. This meant the system could continue operating even when central authority was not immediately present in every decision. And that is what allows empire-scale stability. Not constant control, but structured independence. Western Xia, under sustained pressure, now existed primarily as a weakening system rather than a functioning rival. It could still resist locally. It could still mobilize forces, but it could no longer coordinate effectively across its own territory. And that loss of internal synchronization is the true marker of systemic failure. Not defeat, but disconnection. As this phase progressed, it became increasingly clear that the Mongol system had entered a new category of political organization. It was no longer simply a conquering force. It was a self-expanding structure capable of maintaining coherence across distance through designed interdependence. And that structure was still evolving, still stabilizing, still adapting, but already functioning at a scale that no earlier step system had achieved. And that stability, paradoxically, is what made further expansion possible. Because only stable systems can extend without breaking, and only structured systems can survive their own growth. There comes a point in every long campaign where resistance stops behaving like resistance. It stops expanding. It stops coordinating. It stops producing meaningful strategic variation. It becomes repetition. And repetition under pressure is not survival, it is delay. For Genghis Khan, this was the stage the Western Xia campaign had reached. What had once been a functioning kingdom under Li Anquin was now a system surviving only through fragmented responses. Cities still stood. Armies still formed. Leadership still issued commands. But none of these components were aligned into a coherent whole. And without alignment, even strength becomes ineffective. The Mongol system did not need to intensify at this stage. It only needed to maintain structure, because structure itself was now the decisive advantage. Campaigns against Western Xia no longer resembled the early rapid expansions of Mongol warfare. They were slower, more controlled, less about shock, more about persistence. Each operation was designed not to overwhelm instantly, but to prevent any possibility of recovery. Supply lines were disrupted in sequence. Regional coordination was separated intentionally. Reinforcement routes were neutralized before they could stabilize. And with each layer removed, the remaining structure became more isolated. This is how systemic collapse is engineered without requiring a single decisive battle. At the same time, Mongol forces operating under the broader imperial system continued engagements with other regions, particularly pressure on the Jin dynasty. But even these campaigns followed the same underlying principle. Do not allow recovery. Do not allow consolidation. Do not allow the enemy system to reset. Because reset is what turns defeat into continuation. By now, the Mongol military structure had evolved into something far more sophisticated than its early form. It was no longer dependent on proximity to leadership. Commanders operated with defined strategic autonomy. Communication systems were structured for long-distance coordination. And operational consistency was maintained even across multiple theaters. This allowed simultaneous campaigns to function without central collapse. And that capability is what defines empire-level warfare. Not individual victories, but sustained coordination across distance and time. Within the Western Xia, under Li Anquin, the situation became increasingly constrained. Not because new threats were emerging, but because existing structures were decaying. When coordination fails at the systemic level, even basic governance becomes reactive rather than strategic. Decisions are made to address immediate pressures rather than long-term stability. And this creates a cycle. Short-term survival decisions weaken long-term structure, which then increases dependency on further short-term survival decisions. This feedback loop is what makes systemic collapse irreversible once it reaches a certain threshold. Mongol pressure at this stage was not designed to accelerate collapse artificially. It was designed to ensure that collapse, once initiated, could not be reversed. This is a critical distinction, because many military systems focus on breaking the enemy quickly. The Mongol system at this stage focused on preventing recovery more than forcing immediate defeat. And that shift in objective changes everything about how campaigns are conducted. Meanwhile, inside the Mongol Empire, structural integration of conquered regions continued. This was not passive occupation. It was active embedding of administrative and logistical systems. Routes were secured. Communication channels were extended. Local governance was aligned with imperial structure where possible. And where it was not possible, it was replaced. This ensured that expansion did not create isolated pockets of instability, because isolated instability eventually spreads. At this point, the empire was functioning as a layered system. Military operations supported territorial control. Territorial control supported logistical stability. Logistical stability supported further military operations. Each layer reinforced the others. And Genghis Khan remained at the center of this system, not as a constant commander of battles, but as the architect of structure. His role was increasingly about ensuring coherence across expanding complexity. Not micromanagement, but systemic integrity. As the Western Xia campaign approached its final phase, resistance had become localized rather than strategic. Individual cities might still resist. Individual commanders might still attempt defense. But there was no longer a unified structure behind them. And without structure, resistance becomes isolated effort rather than coordinated strategy. That is the final stage before systemic termination. And once that stage is reached, the outcome is no longer uncertain. Only timing remains. By the end of this phase, Western Xia no longer functioned as an independent political system. It existed as a collapsing network of disconnected centers. And disconnected systems do not survive long under sustained pressure. The Mongol campaign did not need to change dramatically at this point. It only needed to continue operating consistently. Because consistency in the presence of systemic failure is enough to complete the process. And so the campaign moves toward its conclusion. Not through a single dramatic moment, but through the final resolution of an already decided structure. There is a moment in every empire when expansion stops being the most important question. It is replaced by something quieter, more permanent, more dangerous. What happens when the architect is no longer present? For Genghis Khan, this question did not arrive suddenly. It formed gradually during the final phase of his campaigns, as the Western Xia state under Li Anqin reached irreversible structural collapse, and Mongol pressure on the Jin dynasty continued to tighten across multiple fronts. But by this stage, the pattern of war had already stabilized. The Mongol system did not rely on surprise anymore. It relied on continuity. Campaigns continued in layered form, some focused on finishing resistance in Western Xia territory, others maintaining pressure on neighboring states, and others reinforcing newly integrated regions so they would not fracture under their own instability. And through all of this, Genghis Khan was no longer functioning as a field commander in the early sense. He was functioning as the stabilizing center of a distributed system. not because he controlled every action, but because the system still depended on his authority as the final point of coherence. That is the paradox of mature empires. They can operate independently, but they still rely on symbolic and structural unity at the top. And that unity cannot be replaced instantly. It must be inherited. This is why the final campaigns of Genghis Khan's life are not defined by expansion alone. They are defined by completion. Western Xia resistance had reached its final phase. What remained was not strategic resistance, but fragmented survival attempts across isolated regions. Cities that once functioned within a larger political system were now operating without coordination, without reinforcement, and without the ability to restore unity. And in systems like this, endurance does not equal survival. It only delays conclusion. Mongol forces, operating under the broader imperial structure, did not need to escalate intensity further. They maintained operational pressure in a controlled, consistent manner. Enough to prevent recovery, not so much as to create unnecessary instability within newly absorbed regions. Because at this scale, destruction without structure becomes counterproductive. The goal was no longer simply to defeat enemies. It was to ensure that no destabilized system could reform in the vacuum left behind. This is what separates early conquest from imperial consolidation. At the same time, Genghis Khan focused increasingly on succession architecture. He understood that the empire he had created was no longer dependent on his physical presence to function operationally, but it still required structural inheritance to survive long-term. So authority was distributed among his sons and trusted commanders, but in a carefully controlled framework. Not as independent kingdoms, but as interconnected responsibilities within a single system. Each authority was powerful enough to manage regions, but not independent enough to break coherence. This design ensured that no single successor could immediately override the entire structure without destabilizing it. Because Genghis Khan had observed a consistent pattern in history, empires do not usually collapse from external defeat after they become large. They collapse when internal authority becomes concentrated again after decentralization. So he prevented that through structure, not sentiment. As the final phase of his life approached, he returned once more to active campaign oversight in Western Xia territory. Not because the war required escalation, but because completion required confirmation. And in Mongol logic at this stage, unresolved systems are risks, not enemies. The final dissolution of Western Xia occurred not as a singular dramatic moment, but as the final breakdown of any remaining coordination capability within its territory. Once that point was reached, resistance was no longer strategic. It was residual. And residual systems do not recover. They fade into administrative absorption. Shortly after this final phase, Genghis Khan died in 1227 during the Western Xia campaign. But the structure he built did not collapse, because it was no longer dependent on his daily direction. It was dependent on the systems he had embedded: military hierarchy, communication networks, succession design, distributed command logic, and reinforced interdependence between regional authorities. His death, therefore, was not a system-ending event. It was a system transition event. And that distinction is what separates personal empires from structural empires. After his death, the Mongol Empire continued to function, expand, and adapt under his successors. Not because they replicated his personal authority perfectly, but because they inherited a system designed to continue without requiring constant reconstruction. And that is the final outcome of his later campaigns and final years. Not simply conquest, not simply expansion, but the creation of a structure that could outlive its founder. A system that moved beyond the lifespan of the individual who built it. And once that threshold is crossed, history stops being shaped by a person and starts being shaped by what that person designed.